It began with dust rising from the fields of Normandy, a fine, pale dust lifted by summer wind and the distant roar of engines. The landscape was scarred by weeks of fighting, hedgerows torn apart by shells, barns smashed into splinters, fields burned into patches of black earth. The air shimmered with heat and smoke, carrying the faint scent of crushed grass, gunpowder, and something older, something like exhaustion, settling into the soil itself. The German army in France was not retreating in an orderly line. It was collapsing. Slowly, at first, then faster, then all at once. Columns of weary soldiers and battered vehicles pushed through narrow roads, their faces covered in grime, their boots thick with dust. Officers shouted orders drowned by the noise of engines that sputtered from overuse. Artillery rumbled in the distance. The sky above them throbbed, with the steady growl of Allied aircraft circling like patient predators, waiting for the moment to strike. But the real danger was not in the sky. It was on the ground, closing around them, inch by inch. The Falaise Pocket did not begin as a trap. It began as a convergence, Allied forces pushing from east and west, squeezing the German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army into a narrowing corridor of land that once offered escape and now offered only desperation. Villages that had stood for centuries suddenly held strategic significance. Hills became battlegrounds. Roads became lifelines. Fields became graveyards. The Germans fled through dust clouds so thick they seemed to move through a fog of their own, making a fog of fear, fatigue, and disbelief. They knew the encirclement was forming, knew the jaws were tightening, knew the window was shrinking with every passing hour. And yet they ran because what else was left? On the Allied side, the closing of the pocket felt like a race against time, a push toward an objective with consequences too heavy to ignore. Canadian, Polish, British, and American forces advanced through hedgerow country, transformed into a maze of destruction. Tanks rolled forward past burnt-out tractors and shattered homes. Infantry trudged along ditches filled with dust and heat, rifles slung low, eyes scanning every tree line for sudden bursts of fire. The roads leading toward Falaise were clogged not just with soldiers, but with the remnants of a broken campaign, overturned carts, abandoned equipment, animals fleeing through fields, civilians hiding inside cellars that shook with every artillery barrage. Then came the moment when the pocket truly formed, when the jaws snapped shut. The air turned thick with smoke from burning vehicles. Explosions echoed between the hills. Tracer fire stitched the night sky. The ground trembled under the weight of tank treads, grinding across hardened soil. German units trapped inside the pocket fought with a desperation sharpened to a terrifying edge. Some tried to break out in small groups, slipping through narrow corridors under cover of darkness. Others charged forward in larger formations, hoping speed alone might carry them through. But the Allied line was firm, reinforced, unyielding. The battle became a brutal storm, swirling, chaotic, unforgiving. Fields, once bright with summer grain, became wastelands of metal and flame. Roads filled with wreckage stacked so high it created its own terrain. Horses and vehicles alike lay twisted in shapes that felt unreal. The air thickened with smoke and dust until day and night blurred into the same dull haze. For those trapped inside, the Falaise Pocket felt like the world closing, in a place where escape narrowed with each heartbeat, where choices dwindled, where the line between survival and surrender disappeared beneath a sky trembling with aircraft and a ground shaking with artillery. And yet, even inside that nightmare, human stories flickered everywhere. A medic dragging a wounded comrade through a ditch. A tank crew firing their last round before abandoning their vehicle. A soldier pausing beside a ruined farmhouse to drink warm water from a canteen. Officers shouting over the roaring chaos. Men stumbling through fields where smoke merged with dust until vision became a guessing game. When the pocket finally collapsed, what remained was devastation, so complete it felt timeless, as if history itself had carved a scar across the land. Tonight, we return to that moment, to the dust rising beneath August sun, to the desperate push of an army trying to escape a fate already sealed, to the slow, relentless tightening of the Allied noose, to the fields, the roads, the ridges, and the valleys that witnessed one of the most decisive and destructive encirclements of the entire war. Before we go deeper into this story, I want to ask you something quiet, something personal, spoken in your own voice. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? And what hour hangs softly around you? Is it late enough that the world feels muted, or early enough that your night still has its own rhythm? And something deeper, unique to this episode, the Falaise Pocket teaches us that sometimes the world narrows before it opens again. In your own life, has there ever been a moment where you felt surrounded by pressure until a path finally revealed itself? If you want, share what that experience taught you. And if these long, drifting journeys through the past help your thoughts settle, your breath soften, or your eyes grow heavy, consider subscribing. August 1st, 1944, deep in the hedgerows, south of Mortain, a German panzer commander unfolds a message that has travelled directly from the Führer's headquarters in East Prussia, his hands steady despite what he's reading. The order is explicit: attack westward at dawn, drive the Americans back to the sea, restore the front. Around him, his battalion has perhaps 30 operational tanks remaining from the 80 they brought to Normandy 2 months ago. His crews are exhausted, his fuel trucks are half empty, and Adolf Hitler, sitting in a bunker 1,500 miles away, has just ordered him to save the Reich with an offensive that every officer in France knows is madness. Yet the order is absolute, and disobedience is not merely forbidden, it is fatal. The Normandy campaign had reached a pivot point that few recognised in the moment but would define everything that followed. Since the 6th of June, Allied forces had clawed their way inland through some of the most punishing terrain in Europe. The Norman bocage, those ancient hedgerows that turned every field into a fortress, had consumed men and machines at rates that shocked even hardened commanders. But then came late July and Operation Cobra, the American breakout that tore a 30-mile gap in the German lines south of Saint-Lô. Suddenly the static warfare of June and July transformed into something fluid and dangerous. General Omar Bradley's First Army had punched through. General George Patton's newly activated Third Army was racing through the gap, sweeping south and east in great wheeling movements that left German commanders staring at maps in disbelief. The bocage that had protected the Germans now trapped them, and in the map rooms of Allied headquarters, a terrible and beautiful possibility was emerging. They could surround and destroy 2 entire German armies. The forces at risk were staggering in scale. The German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army, approximately 100,000 troops, 1,500 tanks and assault guns, and the logistical apparatus that sustained them, all concentrated in an increasingly narrow pocket of Norman countryside. To the north, British and Canadian forces under Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery pressed southward from Cayenne. To the south and east, American forces wheeled like a closing fist. The gap between them, soon to be known simply as the Falaise Gap, was narrowing with each passing day. Geography was becoming destiny. The small Norman towns that dotted the landscape, Falaise, Argentan, Tron, Chambois, places where farmers had grown wheat for 1,000 years, were about to become the coordinates of catastrophe. Military theorists have a term for this: encirclement. But that clinical word cannot capture what it means when an entire army realizes it's being surrounded by enemies who control the sky. Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge commanded Army Group B, which meant these doomed forces answered to him. A talented officer who had served on the Eastern Front, von Kluge understood tactical reality better than the man giving him orders. He knew that Operation Ludwig Hitler's counteroffensive at Mortain was not a battle plan but a fantasy wrapped in fury. The troops didn't have the strength. The fuel didn't exist. The Americans had air superiority so complete that daytime movement invited immediate destruction. But Hitler's August 2nd directive allowed no ambiguity. The attack must succeed. Not should, not attempt to, must. Von Kluge drafted careful replies suggesting withdrawal, reorganization, a shorter defensive line. Each suggestion was rejected. The Führer's orders stood. And so, on August 7th, German panzer divisions attacked westward at Mortain, achieving initial surprise before American artillery and air power smashed them back. The offensive failed within 48 hours. Those 48 hours gave the Allies time to tighten the noose. On August 8th, Allied fighter bombers spotted the German armour concentration near Mortain in perfect daylight. Pilots broke radio silence with urgent calls. Squadron after squadron diverted to attack. The careful German assembly areas, hidden as best as possible under camouflage and in forests, became target practice for Typhoons and Thunderbolts carrying rockets and bombs. Tank commanders who had survived 3 years of war on the Eastern Front watched in horror as aircraft they couldn't shoot down methodically destroyed their vehicles. One German report from that day noted simply, Luftwaffe absent, enemy air supremacy total. Losses catastrophic. The failure of Lüttich did more than waste German strength. It consumed the time they needed to escape. Every hour spent attacking west was an hour the Allies used to close the trap from north and south. Military historians would later debate whether Hitler's insistence on the Mortain offensive was the single greatest tactical gift he gave the Allied cause in the entire Normandy campaign. In Bradley's headquarters, the realization dawned like sunrise. Maps that had shown German positions scattered across Normandy now showed them concentrated in an increasingly tight space. The enemy wasn't just retreating, they were being herded. Bradley turned to his staff and said words that would be recorded in multiple memoirs. "We're about to destroy an entire German army." The statement was not bravado, but cold assessment. If they could close the gap, if they could link American forces pushing north from Argentan with Canadian and Polish forces pushing south from Falaise, they would trap the Germans in a pocket with no escape. The Seine River lay to the east, too wide and too well covered by Allied air power to cross in force. The only way out was through that narrowing corridor. Close it, and you destroy the German army in France. Fail to close it, and they escaped to fight another day. Everything now depended on speed, coordination, and whether two Allied commanders who barely trusted each other could cooperate long enough to shut the door. Montgomery, commanding all Allied ground forces in Normandy, had his own vision of the operation. He called it the short envelopment, a tight, controlled closing of the trap at Falaise and Argentan. This contrasted with Patton's instinct, which was to drive east all the way to the Seine in a grand, long envelopment that would trap even more Germans, but risk letting the nearest ones escape through a temporarily wider gap. The debate revealed fundamental differences in military philosophy. Montgomery favoured methodical operations, with overwhelming force applied to limited objectives. Casualties must be minimised. Success must be certain before committed. Patton favoured aggressive manoeuvre, accepting risk in exchange for potentially decisive results. Both approaches had merit. Both had achieved victories. But they required different things from the troops executing them, and they could not be pursued simultaneously. Bradley, nominally subordinate to Montgomery but commanding American forces that now outnumbered British and Canadian forces, had to choose which approach to follow. His decision would determine whether the Falaise Pocket became one of the great encirclements of military history or one of history's great missed opportunities. A French farmer named Michel Garnier, whose family had worked land near Chambois for 6 generations, stood in his doorway on the evening of August 7th and watched the road. German vehicles streamed past in an endless column heading east. Trucks, horse-drawn wagons, tanks, artillery pieces towed by half-tracks, staff cars, motorcycles, a river of military equipment flowing past his stone farmhouse. The soldiers looked haggard. Some vehicles limped on damaged suspensions. Horses showed ribs through their coats. This was not the Wehrmacht that had paraded through Normandy in the summer of 1940, immaculate and seemingly invincible. This was an army that had been bled by 2 months of combat against enemies with infinite resources. Garnier, who had lived through the First World War as a boy, recognized the signs. He had seen this before, the moment when an army begins to unravel. He went inside and told his wife they needed to take the children and hide in the root cellar. What was coming would be terrible. The stage was set with almost theatrical precision. To the north, Canadian and British forces preparing Operation Totalize, the offensive that would drive south from Caen toward Falaise. To the south, American XV Corps positioned at Le Mans, ready to strike north toward Argentan. To the west, German armies that had spent their strength in futile counterattacks and now faced encirclement. To the east, the Seine River and beyond, it only retreat. The Norman countryside itself seemed to conspire in the trap. Small roads, narrow lanes, bridges inadequate for modern military traffic, towns with medieval street plans never designed for armour. Every geographic feature that had slowed the Allied advance in June and July would now slow the German retreat in August. And above it all, the weather held clear and bright, perfect flying weather, which meant Allied pilots would have unobstructed views of any movement below. The jaws were closing. The only question was how many Germans would escape before they shut completely. By August 10th, von Kluge had finally received Hitler's grudging permission to withdraw, but the permission came with conditions and restrictions that made it almost meaningless. Units must not retreat precipitously, equipment must be saved, strong rearguards must be maintained. These orders reflected Hitler's consistent pattern, authorizing retreats only after they were already too late to execute cleanly, then imposing conditions that made them more costly. Von Kluge, a capable officer trapped between military reality and political insanity, did what he could. He ordered the strongest formations, primarily SS panzer divisions, to form the western edge of the pocket, holding back Allied pressure while the rest of the army fled east. It was a plan that sacrificed the most fanatical troops to save the rest. Whether this represented cold military logic or moral cowardice remains debated by historians. What is undebatable is that it was already too late. The window for an orderly withdrawal had closed days earlier. What was coming now would not be an organized retreat but a desperate flight through a killing ground where the sky itself had become the enemy. Bernard Law Montgomery stood in his tactical headquarters on the morning of August 6th, studying maps with the intensity that had become his trademark. His command caravan, Spartan and efficient, reflected the man himself, no decoration, no excess, everything organized with surgical precision. He wore his trademark beret and the comfortable clothes he preferred in the field, deliberately unpretentious. Around him, staff officers waited for decisions that would determine whether the Normandy campaign ended in triumph or prolonged stalemate. Montgomery had been criticized, sometimes fairly, for caution since D-Day. The plan had called for capturing Caen on the first day. Instead, it took over a month. British and Canadian casualties had been horrific in the grinding battles south of the city. Now Montgomery had a chance to vindicate his approach with one massive, overwhelming blow. Operation Totalize would send Canadian forces south from Caen to Falaise with unprecedented firepower. If it worked, if they reached Falaise quickly, the northern jaw of the trap would close. If it stalled, the Germans would escape and Montgomery's reputation would never recover. 200 miles to the south, George S. Patton paced like a caged predator at XV Corps headquarters. Everything about Patton contrasted with Montgomery. Where the British Field Marshal was methodical, Patton was impulsive. Where Montgomery planned exhaustively, Patton improvised brilliantly. Where Montgomery sought to minimize casualties through overwhelming preparation, Patton accepted casualties as the inevitable cost of aggressive maneuver. In late July and early August of 1944, Patton was experiencing the greatest moment of his military career. His Third Army had been activated on August 1st and immediately launched into operations that covered more ground faster than any American force in the European theatre. From Avranches through the Gap, south to Le Mans, then wheeling north and east, Patton's columns moved so quickly that German commanders literally lost track of where they were. Maps in German headquarters showed American positions that were 2 days out of date because Patton's forces had already moved 50 miles beyond them. The contrast in command styles was not merely personal but philosophical, reflecting different theories about how modern war should be fought. Montgomery believed in the colossal crack, massing overwhelming force at a single point, breaking through with methodical certainty, then exploiting only as far as supplies and coordination allowed. This approach minimized risk and casualties, but sometimes missed opportunities that required faster decisions. His experience in the First World War, where he had seen entire British battalions destroyed in poorly planned attacks, had convinced him that careful preparation saved lives. Every major operation he planned featured massive artillery barrages, extensive air support, and clear phase lines that units were not to exceed until consolidation was complete. His successes in North Africa, particularly at El Alamein, had validated this approach, but it made him slow in exploitation, and speed was now everything. Patton's philosophy came from studying cavalry raids and mobile warfare throughout history. He believed that speed and aggression created their own advantages, that a moving army was harder to hit than a static one, that exploitation should be pushed until supply lines literally snapped. His formations were often spread thin, his flanks exposed, his logistics officers perpetually terrified, but he had covered 200 miles in 2 weeks, and his rapid movements had contributed directly to the opportunity now emerging. When Patton looked at maps showing the German pocket forming, he saw not a careful encirclement, but a race get there first, close the trap, move on to the next objective. Every day spent coordinating was a day Germans used to escape. In multiple phone calls to Bradley during this period, Patton's frustration became legendary. "Let me go on to Falaise and we'll drive the British back into the sea for another Dunkirk," he told Bradley on August 8th, a comment that was both joke and serious suggestion, and which caused immense friction when British officers later heard about it. The critical meeting occurred on August 8th at Bradley's headquarters in the field. Montgomery, Bradley, and Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower gathered to make the decision that would determine how the encirclement proceeded. The question on the table was deceptively simple. Where should the boundary line between Allied forces be set? This was not merely administrative detail. but the key strategic decision of the battle. If American forces pushed north all the way to Falaise, meeting the Canadians coming south, they might close the gap faster, but they also risked a collision between Allied forces converging from opposite directions. If they set the boundary farther south, giving the Canadians more space to operate, they ensured clear delineation but left a wider gap for Germans to exploit. The discussion was polite, professional, and laden with undertones of national rivalry and personal mistrust. Montgomery favoured setting the American northern limit at Argentan, 15 miles south of Falaise. This gave Canadian forces clear responsibility for closing the northern portion. Patton argued, through Bradley, for pushing to Falaise itself or even beyond. Bradley sided with Montgomery, a decision that would haunt historical debates for decades. His reasoning, explained in multiple post-war accounts, combined military and political factors. Militarily, he feared a friendly fire catastrophe if American and Canadian forces met head-on in the confusion of rapid advance. Both armies would be moving through the same small Norman towns, using similar equipment, in situations where identification might be difficult. The potential for fratricide was real. Politically, Bradley knew that Montgomery, as overall ground commander, technically had authority over the boundary decision, and Bradley did not want to create a command crisis at this critical moment. More subtly, Bradley may have believed Montgomery's forces would perform better in what he expected to be the hardest fighting closing the gap against German breakout attempts. So the decision was made: Americans would advance to Argentan and stop. Canadians would advance from Caen to Falaise and beyond. The boundary was set. The gap, 15 miles wide, at its narrowest, would be the Canadians' responsibility to close. Eisenhower, who had final authority, accepted the plan with reservations he would later express. He understood the logic but also recognized the risk. In his post-war memoir, Crusade in Europe, Eisenhower wrote carefully diplomatic language about the decision, but noted that in retrospect, pushing American forces beyond Argentan might have been the wiser course. This represents about as close as Eisenhower ever came to publicly criticizing a subordinate's decision. The Supreme Commander's role was to maintain Allied unity, and that sometimes meant accepting suboptimal tactical choices to preserve the coalition. The Americans, British, and Canadians were allies by necessity, not by natural affinity. National pride, competing strategic visions, and personality conflicts constantly threatened cooperation. Eisenhower spent as much time managing these internal tensions as he did fighting Germans. The boundary decision reflected this political reality as much as military calculation. On August 10th, as American forces approached Argentan from the south, Patton made one more attempt to change the plan. French units of his XV Corps, specifically the 2nd Armoured Division under General Philippe Leclerc, had reached Argentan and found it lightly defended. Reconnaissance patrols actually pushed several miles north of the town, encountering only scattered German resistance. One patrol got within sight of Falaise, 15 miles away, and reported the road relatively clear. Patton immediately called Bradley. "We've got elements in Argentan. Shall I continue and drive the British into the sea?" The comment was characteristically provocative, mixing humour with genuine tactical suggestion. Bradley's response was immediate and unambiguous. "Nothing doing. You're not to go beyond Argentan. Just stop where you are and build up on that shoulder." Patton protested. Bradley insisted. The conversation ended, and the Germans got 3 more days to use the gap. The human dynamics of this moment deserve emphasis because they determined military outcomes. Bradley was not timid. He had approved Patton's aggressive exploitation for 2 weeks. Montgomery was not incompetent. His planning had created the opportunity for encirclement. Patton was not merely reckless. His rapid advances were based on calculated risks that had succeeded repeatedly. Yet the system they operated within, with divided national commands and unclear authority relationships, created friction that cost time and lives. Military organizations prize clarity of command for precisely this reason. When subordinates must coordinate across national boundaries through superior headquarters, decisions take longer and opportunities close. The Germans, despite Hitler's disastrous interference, at least had unified command in France. The Allies had competing national armies, loosely coordinated through diplomatic negotiations disguised as military planning. It worked, eventually, but it worked messily and at cost. Field Marshal von Kluge, monitoring Allied movements from his headquarters, could not believe his fortune. On August 11th and 12th, he received reports that American forces had reached Argentan but were not advancing farther. The gap remained open. Canadian forces were still fighting their way toward Falaise, miles away, making progress measured in hundreds of yards rather than miles. Von Kluge, who had been planning desperate breakout attacks, suddenly realized he might have time for something approaching an organized withdrawal. He immediately began shifting units, the strongest formations, to hold the western edge of the pocket, the weaker and more valuable headquarters units toward the gap, the wounded toward improvised aid stations in the shrinking pocket center. It was not a good situation. It was still a potential catastrophe, but it was no longer certain annihilation. The Allies had given him the most precious resource a trapped commander can receive: time. By August 14th, the gap between Argentan and Falaise had become the most important piece of real estate in France. 15 miles of Norman countryside, including several small towns and farming villages, represented the difference between destroying the German army in France or allowing it to escape and reconstitute. Allied fighter bombers circled over it constantly, attacking anything that moved. Artillery from both American and Canadian forces could reach into it, yet it remained open because the ground forces that needed to physically close it had not arrived. Montgomery's reputation, already under strain, now depended on how quickly Canadian forces could cover those final miles to Falaise and push beyond. Patton's frustration, already intense, grew more bitter with each day. Americans sat idle at Argentan, while Germans streamed past to the east. And in the pocket itself, approximately 100,000 German troops began the desperate race to escape before the door finally slammed shut. The stage was set for what would become one of World War II's most controversial battles, not because of how it was fought, but because of how it almost wasn't. The night of August 7th to 8th, 1944, brought a sound to Normandy that defied description. 1,000 Royal Air Force heavy bombers approached German positions south of Caen in waves that stretched across 50 miles of sky. The plan called for carpet bombing of enemy defences along the Canadian axis of advance, pulverising strong points before a single soldier moved forward. For the troops in their assembly areas, the bombing was both reassuring and terrifying. Reassuring because it represented overwhelming Allied material superiority. Terrifying because they knew they would soon advance through whatever remained of that landscape. At precisely 11:30 in the evening, the first bombs fell. For the next hour, the ground shook continuously. Trees exploded. Buildings that had stood for centuries simply ceased to exist. German soldiers in bunkers and trenches experienced what survivors would later describe as hell made real. Some went mad from the concussion. Others emerged from shelters physically unharmed but psychologically destroyed. The bombing was meant to create a void the Canadians could drive through. Instead, it created a moonscape. Operation Totalize represented Canadian First Army's most ambitious offensive of the Normandy campaign. Lieutenant General Guy Simons, commanding the operation, knew his reputation depended on its success. Since D-Day, Canadian forces had suffered disproportionate casualties in the grinding battles around Caen. The fighting had been some of the worst of the campaign, German SS panzer divisions defending every field and hedgerow, turning the approaches to the city into a killing ground. Progress was measured in hundreds of yards, purchased with hundreds of lives. Totalize was meant to break this pattern through innovation and overwhelming force. Simons planned a night attack, revolutionary for armoured forces, using radio beacons and tracer fire to guide columns through darkness. He assembled over 600 tanks and organised them into dense formations that would punch through on narrow fronts. And he created history's first large-scale use of armoured personnel carriers by converting self-propelled guns called priests, removing their artillery pieces and using them to carry infantry vehicles called kangaroos that could keep up with tanks and protect soldiers from small arms fire. Dawn on August 8th revealed initial success that quickly transformed into frustration. The first phase of Totalize pushed 7 miles in the first 12 hours, overrunning German forward positions, still stunned from the bombing. Canadian and Polish armour broke through the crust of German defences and drove toward clear terrain beyond. For a few hours that morning, it seemed the breakthrough had succeeded. Staff officers at Simons's headquarters began planning exploitation toward Falaise, just 10 miles away. Then, German defensive doctrine, honed through 3 years of fighting on the Eastern Front, demonstrated its terrible effectiveness. Mobile reserves counterattacked from positions the Allies hadn't detected. 88mm anti-tank guns, camouflaged in tree lines and farm buildings, revealed themselves only when Canadian armour came within killing range. The advance stalled not from breaking contact but from breaking itself against a defence in depth that absorbed the blow and struck back. Verrières Ridge became the symbol of everything that went wrong with Totalize. This modest elevation south of Caen had been fought over for weeks, changing hands multiple times, its slopes littered with the debris of previous battles. The ridge offered observation over the entire Canadian axis of advance, making it tactically critical. German defenders, primarily from the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, had prepared positions there with characteristic thoroughness. When Canadian armour crested the ridge on the afternoon of August 8th, they silhouetted themselves against the sky, a fatal error in tank warfare. German guns fired from hull-down positions, invisible to the advancing Canadians. Sherman tanks began exploding at ranges where their own guns could barely reply. Crews bailed out of burning vehicles. Infantry, following the armour, went to ground under machine gun fire. The momentum that had carried the attack 7 miles in 12 hours stopped dead on Verrières Ridge. The next 8 miles to Falaise would take 8 more days. The Polish 1st Armoured Division entered combat for the first time during Totalize, bringing both exceptional motivation and inevitable inexperience. These were exiled soldiers who had escaped Poland through Romania or the Baltic states after Germany's 1939 invasion, who had regrouped in France, who had been evacuated again in 1940, who had spent years training in Britain for the chance to fight back to their homeland. They attacked with the desperation of men who knew they might never see their families again, and the determination to make their sacrifice meaningful. Under Major General Stanisław Maciek, an armour commander who had learnt his trade fighting both Germans and Soviets, the Polish division pushed toward objectives that would later bear their name. But first battles are always the bloodiest, and the Poles paid tuition in blood for lessons that veteran divisions had already learned. They lost tanks to weapons they didn't recognise. They took casualties from artillery that they hadn't learned to anticipate. They fought bravely and suffered accordingly. By August 10th, just 48 hours into the operation, Totalize had clearly failed to achieve its objectives. Instead of reaching Falaise, Canadian forces sat miles short of the town, held back by German resistance that refused to collapse, despite overwhelming Allied superiority in numbers and firepower. Simons launched a second phase on August 14th, this time preceded by American heavy bombers flying fortresses that were meant to crater German positions along the route. The result was catastrophic in ways no one anticipated. Some bombs fell short, landing on Canadian and Polish positions, killing Allied soldiers and destroying the very units meant to exploit the bombing. The short bombing incident, as it became known, killed or wounded several hundred friendly troops, including a Canadian battalion commander, and shattered morale in units that were already exhausted from days of continuous combat. When the advance resumed, it did so with units that had been bombed by their own air force and now distrusted the coordination that was supposed to help them. Falaise itself finally fell on August 16th, 9 days after Totalize began. The town, medieval and picturesque before the war, had been systematically destroyed by weeks of fighting. The castle that William the Conqueror had built there in the 11th century still stood, its massive stone walls too thick for anything but the heaviest bombs to penetrate, but the town around it was rubble. Canadian infantry entered from the north, fighting house to house against German rearguards that contested every street. By the time they secured the town, Falaise no longer existed in any meaningful sense, just ruins and bodies and the smoke from fires that had been burning for days. The liberation was real and meaningful for the few surviving French civilians who emerged from cellars, but it came too late to close the trap quickly. The gap remained open to the southeast, towards Chambois and Trun, and Germans were using it. The casualties Canadian and Polish forces suffered during Totalize and its aftermath spoke to the intensity of the fighting. Canadian 2nd Corps alone took 5,500 casualties in the operation, killed, wounded, and missing. The Polish 1st Armoured Division, in its first week of combat, lost 1,500 men, roughly 20% of its strength. These were not abstract numbers, but specific individuals, tank crews burned alive in their vehicles, infantry cut down by machine gun fire, artillery crews killed by counter-battery fire they never saw coming. The medical services were overwhelmed. Field hospitals ran out of plasma and morphine. Burial details couldn't keep up with the dead, who lay in summer heat that accelerated decomposition. Veterans of the Italian campaign, men who thought they had seen the worst the war could offer, described the fighting south of Caen as exceeding anything they had experienced previously. The 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, the German formation that had held Verrières Ridge and delayed the Canadian advance, deserves examination because it illustrated both the fanaticism and the tragedy of the Nazi war machine's final years. Formed in 1943 from Hitler Youth members who had been indoctrinated since childhood, the division's soldiers averaged 17 to 18 years old. They had been taught that surrender was betrayal, that retreat was cowardice, that death in battle was the highest honor. They fought with a ferocity that appalled even hardened Allied veterans. Wounded Hitlerjugend soldiers would detonate grenades rather than surrender. Positions would be defended literally to the last man. Counterattacks would be pressed even when tactically hopeless. But they were also teenagers, many away from home for the first time, scared and exhausted, and dying for a regime that had promised them glory and delivered them only to slaughter. By August 1944, the Hitlerjugend division had been nearly destroyed multiple times and rebuilt with even younger replacements. The boys who delayed the Canadian advance to Falaise were performing their final service to a cause already lost. The slow progress toward Falaise had consequences that extended far beyond Canadian casualty lists. Every day the town remained in German hands was a day the pocket's eastern exit remained fully open. Every day German columns could stream through that gap was a day more soldiers and equipment escaped. Allied intelligence estimated that between 50 and 100,000 German troops were trapped in the pocket in mid-August. How many of those escaped depended directly on how quickly the Canadians could close the final miles beyond Falaise to link up with American forces at Argentan. The race was on, but it was a race the Allies were losing to an enemy who should have been already defeated. The gap remained open, the Germans continued to flee, and the opportunity for a truly decisive encirclement, the chance to end the war in France with one crushing blow, was slipping away with each day that passed. Totalize had succeeded in taking ground but failed in its larger purpose, moving fast enough to shut the trap while the Germans were still inside. August 12, 1944, Alençon. French civilians poured into the streets as columns of tanks bearing American white stars and French tricolours entered the town. General Philippe Leclerc's 2nd French Armoured Division, part of Patton's XV Corps, had just liberated the first significant French city in the American zone of advance. For the French tankers, many of whom had been fighting since 1940, this moment justified years of exile and training. Tricolour flags appeared on every building within minutes. Old men wept openly, women kissed soldiers and pressed flowers into their hands. Children climbed on tanks despite the protests of crews who wanted to keep moving. Leclerc himself, standing in his command vehicle, watched the scenes with satisfaction tinged with impatience. Alençon was good, but Paris was the objective that mattered, and Paris lay ahead. For the moment, though, liberation was real and joyous, and in the terrible arithmetic of war, these moments of pure happiness were rare enough to be treasured even amid ongoing combat. The liberation of Alençon represented more than symbolic French participation in France's freedom. It demonstrated that American forces had reached positions from which they could close the Falaise Pocket from the south. Alençon sat roughly 40 miles south of Falaise, within easy striking distance for armoured columns that had just covered 200 miles in 2 weeks. Major General Wade Hyslop, commanding XV Corps, immediately began planning the next phase, a drive north toward Argentan, which would bring American forces to within 15 miles of the Canadians struggling south from Caen. The terrain between Alençon and Argentan offered good tank country, rolling farmland, without the bocage hedgerows that had plagued earlier operations. German resistance in the area seemed light, consisting mainly of scattered rearguards and supply units caught retreating eastward. Everything suggested that a rapid advance could reach Argentan quickly. And beyond Argentan lay Falaise, and beyond Falaise lay the chance to trap the entire German army west of the Seine. On August 13th, American forces entered Argentan with surprising ease. 5th Armoured Division scouts found the town lightly defended, occupied it by midday, and immediately pushed reconnaissance patrols north toward Falaise. What they found astonished them. The road to Falaise was not heavily defended. They encountered German supply columns, stragglers, and scattered defensive positions, but nothing that resembled a coherent front line. Patrol leaders radioed back that, with support, they could reach Falaise by nightfall. The reports went up the chain of command to Hyslop, who immediately contacted Patton. Here was the opportunity Patton had been anticipating: American forces positioned to close the gap from the south, while the Canadians were still miles away from closing it from the north. Patton's response was immediate: push on to Falaise and seal the gap. He then called Bradley to inform him of the situation and his intentions. The phone call between Patton and Bradley on the afternoon of August 13th became one of World War II's most famous command disagreements, preserved in multiple memoirs and histories. Patton was at his most aggressive. "Brad, we've got elements in Argentan. Let me go on to Falaise and we'll drive the British back into the sea for another Dunkirk." The comment about Dunkirk was vintage Patton, simultaneously a joke, a serious tactical proposal, and a provocation designed to get a reaction. Bradley, true to form, was not amused. His response was unequivocal. "Nothing doing. You're not to go beyond Argentan. Just stop where you are and build up on that shoulder. The German is going to attack south. To break through, you'll need all the strength you've got to hold them." Patton protested. Bradley insisted. The conversation ended with Bradley's order standing and Patton barely containing his fury. Bradley's reasoning, explained in his post-war memoir A Soldier's Story, combined military calculation with command politics in ways that historians still debate. Militarily, he feared collision between American forces pushing north and Canadian forces pushing south, both converging on the same small Norman towns in the confusion of rapid advance. The potential for fratricide, American and Canadian units shooting at each other, was real. Both armies used similar equipment. Identification at distance was difficult. The battle space was chaotic. Bradley had vivid memories of friendly fire incidents earlier in the campaign, including the Cobra short bombing that had killed Lieutenant General Leslie McNair. He did not want to add Americans killing Canadians at Falaise to that list. Additionally, he expected Germans to attempt a breakout southward through the American lines at Argentan, and wanted a solid shoulder to contain that attack. Better to have Americans in strong defensive positions than scattered in the pursuit. The political dimension was more subtle but equally important. Montgomery, as overall ground commander for the invasion, technically had authority to set boundary lines between Allied forces. Bradley, though commanding more divisions than Montgomery by August, was still nominally subordinate in the theatre command structure. Eisenhower's headquarters had approved the boundary at Argentan, giving Canadians responsibility for the sector from their north. For Bradley to unilaterally change that boundary by pushing to Falaise would create a command crisis at the worst possible moment. It would publicly contradict Montgomery's plan. It might be perceived as American arrogance, disregarding British plans in favour of aggressive action. The potential damage to Allied unity, Bradley calculated, outweighed the tactical advantage of closing the gap a few days earlier. This was coalition warfare, and coalition warfare required political sensitivity alongside military effectiveness. Patton's fury at being restrained was volcanic. His diary entries from August 13th and 14th are remarkable documents, full of profanity and frustration that his published memoirs later sanitized. He believed, with considerable justification, that he could close the gap, that his forces were positioned to end the campaign decisively, and that Bradley's caution was allowing Germans to escape who would later have to be fought again. "We could have bagged the entire German army," he wrote. "Instead, we sat idle while Bradley worried about British feelings. The assessment was harsh, but contained truth. American forces at Argentan were closer to Falaise than Canadians at Caen. They faced lighter resistance. They had momentum, and they were ordered to stop and wait." For a commander whose entire philosophy emphasized aggressive exploitation, the order to halt at Argentan was professionally excruciating and personally infuriating. The gap, those 15 miles between Argentan and Falaise, now became the single most important piece of terrain in France. Every hour it remained open was an hour German columns could use to escape eastward. Allied reconnaissance pilots circling overhead reported endless streams of vehicles moving through the corridor. Fighter bombers attacked continuously, destroying hundreds of trucks, tanks, and artillery pieces, but they could not physically block the road with their presence. Only ground troops could do that, and ground troops were not there. Americans sat at Argentan, looking north. Canadians struggled toward Falaise, looking south. Between them, the Germans fled. Intelligence estimates suggested that by August 15th, as many as 40 to 50,000 Germans had already escaped through the gap, along with perhaps 200 armoured vehicles. These were not complete units with their full equipment. Most had abandoned heavy weapons and many vehicles for lack of fuel, but they were soldiers who would fight again, cadres around which shattered divisions could be rebuilt. On August 14th, an incident occurred that perfectly illustrated the frustration of the boundary decision. An American reconnaissance patrol from 5th Armored Division, either through confusion about exact boundary lines or through deliberate initiative, pushed north from Argentan nearly to the outskirts of Falaise. They actually made radio contact with Canadian patrols approaching from the north. For a few minutes, American and Canadian soldiers were within sight of each other, separated by perhaps 2 miles containing scattered German forces. The patrol leader requested permission to advance and link up. The request was denied. He was ordered to withdraw back to Argentan immediately. The patrol withdrew. The gap remained open. That evening, Allied intelligence estimated that 10,000 more Germans used the corridor to escape. The soldiers in that patrol, who had driven to within sight of closing the pocket, then been ordered back, understood at a visceral level what their commander's decisions had cost. Eisenhower, reviewing the situation from Supreme Headquarters, began to have doubts about the boundary decision, but maintained public support for his subordinates. His August 15th diary entry, preserved in his papers, shows a commander trying to balance military effectiveness against coalition politics. Bradley's decision to stop at Argentan was made for sound reasons at the time, though we may later question whether the caution was excessive. This careful language masked deeper concerns. Eisenhower understood that the Falaise encirclement, though ultimately successful, was not achieving the decisive destruction initially hoped for. Too many Germans were escaping. The victory would be significant but not complete. And while he could not say so publicly without undermining his subordinate commanders, he privately wondered whether American aggressiveness might have served better than Allied coordination in this particular case. By August 16th, when Canadian forces finally secured Falaise and began pushing beyond the town towards Chambois and Trun, the gap had been open for nearly a week since Americans reached Argentan. That week allowed organised German withdrawals, allowed headquarters units to escape with their irreplaceable staff and documents, allowed the survival of cadres that would form the nucleus of rebuilt divisions. Bradley defended his decision then and in his memoirs, arguing that the boundary line prevented friendly fire casualties and that the ultimate encirclement, even if delayed, destroyed the German army in France. Patton never forgave what he saw as excessive caution that let the enemy escape. Montgomery, caught between defending his force's rate of advance and acknowledging the delay, pointed to the fierce German resistance and argued that only methodical application of force could have succeeded regardless of where American forces stopped. The debate would continue in histories and memoirs for decades, a permanent question mark over one of the campaign's critical moments. The only certainty was that the gap had been open when it might have been closed, and that Germans had escaped who might have been trapped. August 12, 1944, a German company commander named Hauptmann Friedrich Weber stood at a crossroads 5 miles west of Falaise and watched his world collapse in real time. Orders had arrived an hour earlier. Hold this position at all costs, prevent Allied breakthrough, allow the army to withdraw eastward. His company numbered 60 men from the 140 it had landed with in Normandy 2 months prior. They had 3 machine guns, limited ammunition, no anti-tank weapons, and sporadic radio contact with battalion headquarters. Behind his position, clearly visible on the road, stretching eastward, an endless column of German vehicles streamed toward the Seine trucks, horse-drawn wagons, staff cars, walking wounded, headquarters units, supply trains, the entire logistical apparatus of 2 armies flowing past his tiny blocking position. Weber's orders were clear, but his situation was absurd. He was meant to stop Allied armour with 60 riflemen so that clerks and cooks could escape. Military logic had become a dark comedy, except the punchline would be delivered in high explosive. The German word Kessel translates roughly as cauldron, the term their military used for encirclements since the Eastern Front campaigns, where entire armies had been trapped and destroyed. By mid-August, the soldiers in Normandy knew they were in a Kessel without needing staff officers to explain the operational situation. You could tell by watching the roads, everything flowing east, nothing coming west. You could tell by the aircraft, endless Allied fighters circling overhead like predators, diving to attack anything that moved. You could tell by the artillery, the sound of guns from all directions, the pocket shrinking audibly, and you could tell by the orders, which shifted from attack to hold to withdraw to every man for himself with dizzying speed. The German army in Normandy, which in June had been a formidable defensive force, was by mid-August a trapped mob unified only by the desperate desire to escape before the pocket closed completely. Inside a German field hospital near Trun, Dr. Hans Dietrich worked under conditions that would have been unthinkable 6 weeks earlier. The hospital, such as it was, occupied a partially collapsed barn and several tents set up in an orchard. Wounded men lay on straw, on stretchers, directly on the ground. Supply trucks that should have arrived with plasma and morphine had been destroyed by air attack. The surgical instruments Dietrich used had been sterilized exactly once that week over a fire made from broken fence posts. He operated by candlelight at night, by daylight that filtered through shell holes in the barn roof during the day. The sounds of battle, artillery, tank guns, aircraft grew steadily louder, coming from directions that changed hourly as the perimeter shrank. Wounded men who could still walk began leaving without authorization, preferring to take their chances escaping than remaining to be captured or killed. Dietrich, who had trained at Heidelberg and imagined a surgical career before the war, found himself performing amputations without anesthesia on teenage soldiers who screamed for mothers they would never see again. The Luftwaffe, which had once ruled the skies over Europe, was by August 1944 a fading memory in Normandy. A German Air Force officer named Lieutenant Karl Hoffmann kept a diary during the pocket battles that survived the war and provides extraordinary insight into the perspective of troops under total enemy air supremacy. His August 15th entry is particularly telling. Any movement in daylight brings immediate attack from Jabos, the German slang for Jagbomber fighter bombers. We exist from hole to hole. At dawn we hide the vehicles under trees and camouflage netting. We wait. At dusk we move a few kilometres and hide again. Last night we covered 8 kilometres in 3 hours. At this rate we will reach the Seine sometime next year, assuming we live that long. The bitter humour of men under stress pervades the diary. In another entry, Hoffmann describes watching Allied aircraft circle overhead. They fly in formations, like they're on parade. Our anti-aircraft guns are silent, either destroyed or out of ammunition. We might as well throw rocks. The dimensional facts of the pocket's shrinkage tell the story in cold numbers. On August 12th, the pocket measured roughly 25 miles east to west, 15 miles north to south, approximately 375 square miles, containing somewhere between 80,000 and 120,000 German troops. The estimates vary. By August 15th, those dimensions had contracted to approximately 15 miles by 8 miles 120 square miles. By August 18th, the pocket measured less than 8 miles by 5 miles 40 square miles. The density of trapped forces increased as the space decreased. Units that had maintained some dispersion for protection against air attack found themselves compressed together. Roads became impassable with traffic, fields filled with abandoned vehicles and supply dumps. The concentration of targets made every Allied artillery barrage and airstrike devastatingly effective. Soldiers described the sensation of the world physically shrinking, horizons closing in, space itself becoming weaponized. Field Marshal Walter Model arrived to take command of Army Group B on August 17th, replacing the disgraced von Kluge, who had disappeared for 12 hours on August 15th and was suspected of attempting to negotiate surrender with the Allies. Model, a hard-nosed tactician who specialized in defensive operations and had earned Hitler's confidence on the Eastern Front, assessed the situation with the cold calculation that characterized his command style. He toured the pocket's perimeter, ignoring air attacks and artillery fire, and made decisions with brutal clarity. Some units would be sacrificed to hold the western perimeter while others escaped. The strongest formations, primarily SS Panzer divisions, would form the rearguard. Headquarters units, specialists, and trained cadres would receive priority for evacuation. Everything else was expendable. Model's assessment to Hitler was characteristically blunt. The army in Normandy is being destroyed. We can save perhaps 30 to 40% if we act immediately and ruthlessly. The 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, which had delayed Canadian forces at Verrières Ridge, now held the critical western edge of the pocket near Falaise. These teenage SS soldiers, indoctrinated since childhood in Nazi ideology and trained to view surrender as ultimate betrayal, fought with a ferocity that appalled even hardened Allied veterans. They launched counterattacks that had no strategic purpose except buying time for others to escape. They held positions until literally overrun, then fought hand-to-hand rather than surrender. A Canadian after-action report from August 16th describes encountering a Hitlerjugend position. Bunker contained 8 enemy dead, no wounded, no prisoners. They fought to the last man. This was not normal military behavior, but ideological fanaticism turned tactical doctrine. The cost was horrific. The Hitlerjugend division, which had numbered 20,000 men in June, was reduced to fewer than 300 combat-effective soldiers by late August. They bought time with teenage lives, sacrificing themselves so that less fanatical units might survive. Fuel exhaustion became as deadly as Allied firepower. German armour that had survived 2 months of combat now sat immobilised because the tankers that should have supplied them had been destroyed by air attack. Tank crews faced impossible choices: abandon their vehicles and flee on foot, remaining with them hoping fuel arrived, or attempting to drive them dry and inevitably stalling in the middle of roads where they became obstacles to everyone else's escape. The roads through the pocket became littered with abandoned tanks, some perfectly functional except for empty fuel tanks, others damaged but repairable under normal circumstances. Crews removed the breech blocks from guns before abandoning their vehicles, rendering them useless to the enemy, and joined the flood of soldiers moving east on foot. Panthers and Tigers that had dominated Allied armour in direct combat were left behind, like obsolete junk, because the logistical system needed to sustain them had collapsed. The psychological transformation of trapped soldiers deserves attention because it illuminated something fundamental about human behaviour under extreme stress. German troops in early June had believed in victory, or at least in their ability to hold Normandy indefinitely. By late July, belief had shifted to hope perhaps they could stabilise the situation, perhaps reinforcements would arrive, perhaps the Western Allies would negotiate. By mid-August, inside the pocket, belief and hope had been replaced by pure survival instinct. Officers lost control of demoralised troops. Discipline, which had held through 2 months of combat, began fracturing. Soldiers abandoned their units to join groups heading east. Supply dumps were looted. Some soldiers changed into civilian clothes taken from French homes, hoping to disappear after capture. Yet, alongside this disintegration, pockets of resistance fought with desperate intensity. The German army in the Falaise Pocket simultaneously collapsed and resisted, disintegrated and cohered, fled and fought. The contradiction was human rather than military: fear and duty, survival and honour, collapse and discipline all coexisting in the same men at the same moment. Von Kluge's August 15th disappearance and subsequent suicide added an element of high tragedy to the pocket's endgame. The field marshal, knowing he was suspected of disloyalty because he had spent 12 hours out of radio contact while supposedly inspecting frontline positions, wrote a final letter to Hitler before taking poison on August 19th. The letter, preserved in archives, reads like something from classical tragedy. When you receive this letter, I shall be no more. I cannot bear the accusation of disloyalty. I have done my duty to the utmost of my ability. Whether von Kluge had actually been attempting to contact the Allies for surrender negotiations or had simply been caught in communication breakdowns during combat remains historically unclear. What is clear is that the pressure of commanding a doomed army, under Hitler's increasingly unhinged orders, while suspected of treason by subordinates and superiors alike, broke even a capable professional officer. His suicide marked the end of any illusion that the situation in Normandy could be salvaged through competent leadership. The army was being destroyed, the commanders were dying or fleeing, and the only question remaining was how many would escape before the trap finally closed. August 14th, 1944, 0800 hours. Flight Lieutenant James Lester of the Royal Air Force's 183rd Squadron pulled his Hawker Typhoon into a diving attack run over the road southeast of Falaise. Below him, stretched along 3 miles of Norman country lane, a German column moved eastward toward the gap. Trucks, horse-drawn wagons, troops on foot, hundreds of vehicles, and thousands of men caught in the open under perfect flying weather. Lester armed his rockets, 8 RP-3 projectiles, each carrying a 60-pound warhead, and selected his target, a cluster of vehicles, at a crossroads where the column had bunched up. He dove through 2,000 feet at 300 miles per hour, lined up the shot, and fired. The rockets leaped off their rails, trailing smoke. 3 seconds later, the first impact, a truck exploding in an orange fireball. Then another, then a fuel tanker erupting in a mushroom of black smoke. Lester pulled out of his dive so hard the G-forces grayed his vision, climbed back to altitude, and turned for another pass. Below, the column scattered like insects, vehicles veering into ditches, men running for tree cover. But there was nowhere to hide from an enemy who owned the sky. The Hawker Typhoon represented the cutting edge of Allied tactical air power in 1944. A big, brutish fighter-bomber designed around a massive engine, the Typhoon was fast, heavily armed, and purpose-built for ground attack. 4 20mm cannons provided devastating firepower against light vehicles and infantry. 8 RP-3 rockets gave it anti-armor capability that pilots half-jokingly called flying artillery. The aircraft wasn't pretty thick wings, a humped fuselage, a reputation for engine problems, but in the tank-busting role it proved extraordinarily effective. Pilots described the experience of diving on German columns as almost surreal in its ease. The enemy had no effective air defense. They couldn't shoot back meaningfully. They could only die. One pilot recalled, "It was like hunting rabbits from a car. You felt almost bad about how unfair it was. Then you remembered what they'd done to Europe, and you fired again." The scale of Allied air operations over the Falaise Pocket dwarfed anything previously attempted in tactical air support. RAF 2nd Tactical Air Force and US 9th Tactical Air Command together committed over 2,000 fighter bombers to the battle in mid-August. On peak days, August 14th through 17th, they flew between 500 and 700 sorties per day over the pocket. That meant every 3 to 4 minutes, 24 hours a day, another aircraft arrived over the target area. Pilots described circuits patterns where multiple aircraft would stack up at different altitudes, each waiting their turn to dive on targets below, like customers at a deadly carousel. Ground controllers with Canadian and American forces directed them to specific targets. Armor concentration 2 kilometers north of your position. Vehicle column on-road junction 734. The system worked with industrial efficiency, turning air power into a form of precision demolition. The Typhoon's RP-3 rocket specifically became the weapon that German tankers feared most. The 60-pound warhead could penetrate 3 inches of armor plate under ideal conditions, enough to kill most German tanks except Tigers and Panthers at oblique angles. But the rockets were area weapons, not precision instruments. Aiming them required diving to low altitude, firing at ranges where you could see individual vehicles clearly, and accepting that perhaps 3 out of 8 rockets would hit near the intended target. The rest would impact harmlessly or kill something other than what you'd aimed at. Yet volume compensated for accuracy. When 4 Typhoons each fired 8 rockets at a German column, 64 rockets landed in an area the size of several football fields. Something died. Usually many things died. Tank crews described the sound of rocket attacks as terrifying, a screaming whistle followed by impacts that threw up fountains of earth and shrapnel. If you were near a hit, the blast could disable your tank through concussion alone without penetrating armor. American P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs complemented the RAF Typhoons with different but equally devastating capabilities. The Thunderbolt, nicknamed the Jug for its rotund shape, carried up to 2.5 tons of bombs and could strafe with 8 50 caliber machine guns that fired 3,000 rounds per minute combined. Mustangs, faster and more elegant, excelled at armed reconnaissance, sweeping ahead of ground forces to find targets, marking them for other aircraft, then attacking themselves if opportunity permitted. Together, these Allied aircraft created a 3-dimensional battlefield where the sky was as dangerous as the ground. German soldiers described learning to recognize aircraft by engine sound, the Typhoon's distinctive roar, the Thunderbolt's throaty growl, the Mustang's high-pitched whine. Each sound meant death approaching from a direction you couldn't defend against. The briefing on August 14th at a forward RAF base captured the operational reality with brutal simplicity. Squadron commander addressing pilots before the day's missions, anything moving inside the pocket is hostile. Vehicles, horses, troops on foot, you are weapons free. Rules of engagement. If it's moving east and it's not us, kill it. No restrictions, no hesitations, no need to confirm targets individually. The pocket had become what modern doctrine calls a free fire zone, a designated area where anything encountered was assumed enemy and engaged on sight. This represented both overwhelming Allied superiority and the moral simplification that total war enabled. There were no civilians in the pocket. By mid-August, they had fled or been evacuated weeks earlier. There were no friendly forces at risk. Coordination ensured Allied units stayed outside the target area. There was only the enemy, trapped and visible, and pilots authorized to destroy them with every weapon available. A Luftwaffe officer's account provides the view from below. Oberleutnant Werner Schmidt, part of a supply unit caught in the pocket, wrote in a letter home that was recovered after his capture. "We heard the aircraft. Always we heard them. Morning, afternoon, evening, they circled like vultures. We scattered into ditches whenever we heard engines. The rockets hit the road where we had been standing seconds before. 5 trucks obliterated in less than a minute, men torn apart, horses screaming, and the aircraft climbed away, circled, and came back for another pass. Hell must be something like this, fire from the sky, no escape, no shelter, just waiting to die. The letter never reached its destination. Schmidt was captured 3 days later, physically unharmed but psychologically shattered, one of tens of thousands who surrendered simply to escape the air attacks that made movement suicidal. The debate over air power's actual effectiveness versus its psychological impact continues among historians. Official RAF assessments credited pilots with destroying over 300 tanks in the pocket. Post-battle surveys found significantly fewer destroyed tanks, perhaps 100 to 150 confirmed armor kills directly attributable to air attack. The discrepancy reflects the difficulty of confirming kills from the air. Pilots reported tanks destroyed that were actually damaged or abandoned. They reported vehicles killed that were already immobilized by other causes. The chaos of battle made accurate assessment impossible. However, the psychological effect of continuous air attack was undeniable and perhaps more important than physical destruction. German columns stopped moving in daylight because movement invited immediate attack. This paralysis during half of each day, multiplied across a week, reduced the pocket's evacuation capacity by 50%. Soldiers abandoned vehicles that might have been saved because fear of air attack made recovery impossible. The terror of total air supremacy achieved effects that bombs and rockets alone could not. August 17th brought a sortie that entered RAF legend. Flight Lieutenant Pierre Clostermann, a Free French pilot flying Typhoons with a RAF squadron, encountered a German column near Trun and made 11 separate attack passes in a single sortie. He fired all 8 rockets, expended all his cannon ammunition, and continued diving on the column just to scatter it with the sound of his engines. His post-mission report counted over 300 vehicles destroyed or damaged by his squadron that afternoon. Other pilots confirmed the area was saturated with targets, so many vehicles in such a small space that you literally could not miss. Klosterman described the experience in his memoir. It was massacre from a safe altitude. I felt sick after the 5th pass. Then I thought about occupied France and made 6 more passes. The moral complexity of overwhelming force used against a trapped enemy who cannot effectively resist appears repeatedly in pilots' accounts. Satisfaction at mission success mixed with queasiness at the one-sided nature of the killing. The weather factor deserves emphasis because it represented the margin between German disaster and German annihilation. From August 13th through 18th, Normandy enjoyed near-perfect flying weather, clear skies, good visibility, light winds. Had the weather turned poor, as it often did in northern France, Allied air power would have been grounded or severely limited. Clouds would have provided cover for German movement. Rain would have reduced sortie rates. The Germans might have evacuated twice as many troops under cover of weather. But the skies remained clear. The forecast predicted continued good conditions, and the Allied air forces exploited every hour of visibility to maximum effect. Model, surveying the situation on August 17th, reportedly commented to his staff, "If it rains tomorrow, we can save 50,000 men. If the weather holds clear, we save nothing." The weather held clear, and the killing from above continued without pause until the pocket ceased to exist. Night of August 18th to 19th, 1944, the road through Chambois had become the last exit from hell. German columns pushed through the small Norman town in darkness, moving with desperate urgency that transformed military retreat into pure flight. Officers on horseback led units that no longer had functioning vehicles. Soldiers stumbled on foot, carrying wounded comrades, abandoning equipment too heavy to carry farther. Horse-drawn artillery pieces clattered over cobblestones, the animals near collapse from exhaustion and lack of fodder. Scattered tanks and assault guns provided what little armoured protection remained, but fuel shortages meant even these travelled slowly, conserving every litre for the final push to the Seine. Above the chaos, artillery fire from multiple directions, Canadian guns to the north, American guns to the south, Polish guns from the hill to the northeast. The night sky flickered with muzzle flashes and burning buildings, and through this maelstrom, tens of thousands of men tried to escape before dawn brought Allied aircraft back and the corridor closed forever. Chambois itself, a town of perhaps 1,500 inhabitants before the war, occupied tactically critical terrain without anyone planning for that significance. The town sat in a shallow valley where several roads converged, making it a natural choke point for movement from west to east. The Dives River, small but marshy, paralleled the road to the north, channeling traffic through the town rather than around it. Stone buildings from previous centuries lined narrow streets designed for carts, not military vehicles. Under normal circumstances, Chambois was picturesque, medieval church, market square, rural Norman architecture. Under the circumstances of August 1944, Chambois was a killing bottle where thousands would die in less than 48 hours. Geography had conspired with military necessity to transform a pleasant market town into an abattoir. Polish 1st Armoured Division, fighting its way southeast from Falaise, reached Hill 262, overlooking Chambois at dawn on August 19th. The position, which Polish soldiers immediately nicknamed Maczuga, the Mace, dominated the valley below, with observation extending for miles. Major General Stanisław Maciek, commanding the division, recognized immediately that whoever held this hill controlled the escape route. He ordered his remaining tanks, perhaps 90 combat-effective vehicles from the 145 the division had landed with, to dig in on the hilltop. Artillery observers set up positions with clear fields of fire. Infantry established defensive positions expecting German counterattacks. Then, as daylight strengthened, they saw what they had captured, the entire remaining German pocket spread below them, columns of troops and vehicles moving eastward through a corridor now less than 2 miles wide. Maciek called for artillery fire. His guns opened up on the densest concentrations. The slaughter began. The Polish position on Maczuga came under immediate and ferocious German counterattack. Units still capable of offensive action, primarily elements of the 2nd and 9th SS Panzer Divisions, recognized that the hill had to be retaken or the escape route would be closed by artillery fire. They attacked from multiple directions with everything they had left: tanks, assault guns, infantry and captured Allied vehicles. The Poles held, but at terrible cost. Over the next 3 days, fighting essentially surrounded on a hilltop, while German forces tried to break through or past them, the Polish division suffered 1,325 killed and wounded from its original strength of 16,000, nearly 50% casualties. Units ran out of ammunition and were resupplied by airdrops that often fell inside German-held territory. The wounded overwhelmed the medical staff. At night, Polish soldiers could hear German columns passing below them, close enough to throw grenades, too numerous to stop completely. They held because retreat would betray their mission and because they were Polish soldiers who had already lost their country and would not surrender their honour. Canadian forces approaching Chambois from the north faced German resistance that defied rational explanation given the tactical situation. SS rearguards continued fighting in the ruins of villages that no longer had strategic value, in positions they could not hold, against enemies who could simply bypass them. A Canadian battalion commander's report from August 19th describes encountering a German position south of Trun, estimated 20 to 30 enemy in stone farmhouse, refused surrender demands, required artillery and tank fire to reduce position, found 28 enemy dead when we entered, no wounded, no prisoners. They fought until killed. This pattern repeated across dozens of similar positions. The fanaticism of SS indoctrination, combined with the certainty of being trapped if captured, produced a defense-to-the-death mentality that shocked even veteran Allied troops. It also bought precious hours for less ideological units to escape. American forces pushing north from Argentan finally linked with Polish forces near Chambois on the afternoon of August 19th, officially closing the pocket. Soldiers from the 90th US Infantry Division met Polish tankers from Maczek's division in the town centre, amid scenes of mutual exhaustion and relief. They shook hands, shared cigarettes, and looked at the carnage surrounding them with the 1,000-yard stare common to men who have seen too much. The link-up was more symbolic than actual gaps remained in the perimeter. German forces continued flowing through weak points, and the closed pocket leaked like a sieve. But the principle had been established. Allied forces controlled the escape corridor. Everything now depended on whether the perimeter could be held against German breakout attempts, and whether those already outside the pocket could be prevented from rescuing those still inside. The road through Chambois and the surrounding corridor earned its nickname the Corridor of Death, through scenes that traumatized even combat veterans. A Canadian chaplain, entering the area on August 20th to minister to wounded and dying, recorded his impressions. The dead were everywhere. Horses and men and vehicles, you could not distinguish where one ended and another began. The smell was indescribable. Bodies had been lying in August heat for days. We had to wrap cloth around our faces to approach. I saw things that day that I will take to my grave. The density of destruction reflected the final concentration of German forces into a space measured in hundreds of yards, artillery fire and air attack landing in an area where troops and equipment were packed too tightly to disperse. Mathematical principles of target density made every explosive more effective. One artillery shell that might have killed a few men in open terrain killed dozens in the packed corridor. German medical units caught in the corridor faced impossible ethical choices. Dr. Hans Dietrich, the surgeon whose field hospital had been near Trun, led approximately 200 wounded soldiers toward Chambois on August 19th, hoping to reach safety before being overrun. They didn't make it. Surrounded by Allied forces, out of supplies, with wounded men who could not be moved farther, Dietrich made the decision to surrender. He approached Canadian lines under a white flag fashioned from a bedsheet and negotiated the surrender of his entire group. "We have no supplies, no ammunition, and our men have not eaten in 3 days," he told the Canadian officer who accepted his surrender. "We are doctors and wounded. We ask for treatment as prisoners under Geneva Convention." The Canadians accepted the surrender, provided immediate medical attention, and sent the wounded to prisoner of war hospitals. Dietrich survived the war, returned to Germany, and never practiced surgery again. The trauma of the pocket had destroyed his ability to operate without intrusive memories. The equipment destroyed in the corridor provided evidence of the scale of German losses. Post-battle surveys by Allied intelligence teams counted vehicles and weapons with meticulous care. The official tally from the Chambois-Trun corridor alone, over 500 tanks and assault guns destroyed or captured, more than 1,000 artillery pieces, approximately 10,000 vehicles of all types, trucks, staff, cars, motorcycles, horse-drawn wagons. These numbers represented not just material losses but the destruction of German military capability in France. Tanks could not be replaced quickly. Production of Panthers averaged 300 per month for the entire German military. Artillery pieces required specialized manufacturing. Even trucks, which seemed replaceable, were in desperately short supply given Germany's fuel crisis. The equipment losses guaranteed that even Germans who escaped the pocket personally would not be combat effective for weeks or months while they were re-equipped. The human toll in the corridor remains uncertain because German records from this period were largely destroyed or lost. Allied estimates suggested 10,000 to 15,000 Germans killed in the immediate pocket area, primarily in the Chambois corridor during the final days. This number, already horrific, does not include those who died during the earlier fighting, those who died after escaping the pocket, or those who were wounded and later died of their injuries. German military historians after the war estimated total casualties, killed, wounded, captured, at around 50,000 for the pocket phase of operations. These are men removed permanently from German military strength. They do not include the perhaps 20,000 to 40,000 who escaped, but without their equipment, reaching the Seine as demoralized, disorganized survivors rather than combat-effective soldiers. The Falaise Pocket did not destroy the German army in France completely, but it broke it beyond rapid repair. August 20th, 1944, General Dwight D. Eisenhower stood beside General Omar Bradley on a road southeast of Chambois, staring at a landscape that redefined their understanding of industrial warfare's destructive capacity. They had come to assess the battlefield, to see firsthand what the Falaise encirclement had achieved. What they saw exceeded description. The road itself was impassable, except by walking on wreckage, burned vehicles piled atop each other, dead horses bloating in summer heat, equipment scattered in chaos that suggested panic. Eisenhower commented to Bradley, "You can drive for hundreds of yards on the roads without touching the ground, over dead horses and men and equipment." This was not metaphor, and engineers would confirm that some road sections had debris stacked so densely that you literally stepped from one piece of wreckage to another without touching pavement. The Supreme Commander had seen battlefields before, but nothing had prepared him for Falaise's particular concentration of death. War correspondent Ernie Pyle, who had covered combat from North Africa through Italy and Normandy, arrived at Chambois on August 21st seeking material for dispatches. What he found challenged his ability to write. Pyle, whose columns had made him America's most beloved war journalist through his focus on ordinary soldiers' experiences, struggled to convey the pocket's aftermath in terms readers could comprehend. His August 23rd column began, "The smell, you could not escape it. Even Normandy beach had not been like this. That was fresh death. This was death that had been lying for days in summer sun." He described trying to walk through the battlefield and having to turn back because his gas mask designed to filter chemical weapons could not filter the stench of decomposition. He described French civilians returning to check on their homes, emerging from cellars, and immediately vomiting from the smell. He described veteran soldiers, men who had fought through months of combat, refusing to enter certain areas because the carnage was simply too overwhelming. Allied intelligence officers descended on the battlefield with specific missions: assess German casualties, catalogue destroyed equipment, recovered documents from destroyed headquarters vehicles. Captain Samuel Mitchell, attached to 12th Army Group Intelligence, led a team tasked with counting vehicles. They started on August 21st and worked for a week, moving systematically through the corridor, recording everything they found. Mitchell's final report listed 344 tanks and assault guns, destroyed or captured 2,447 vehicles of all types, 252 artillery pieces. These numbers were conservative. They counted only equipment identifiable and accessible. Much had burned beyond recognition. Much lay in ditches or fields they couldn't reach. The actual totals were certainly higher. But even the conservative counts represented material losses Germany could not afford and could not quickly replace. The German dead posed an immediate crisis that transcended military concerns into public health emergency. Approximately 10,000 bodies, plus perhaps 5,000 dead horses, lay exposed in August heat across an area of roughly 50 square miles. Decomposition advanced rapidly. Disease risks became acute. French civilian authorities approached Allied military government officers with desperate requests for assistance. The town of Chambois had no population, everyone had fled, but it had thousands of corpses. Trun had similar problems. Small villages across the battlefield zone faced contamination of water supplies, clouds of flies that spread disease, and the psychological trauma of existing beside mass death. Allied military government officials requisitioned bulldozers, brought in engineer battalions, and began the grim work of battlefield clearance. Graves registration units, the soldiers responsible for handling Allied dead, found themselves overwhelmed by German casualties they were also required to handle under Geneva Convention protocols. Lieutenant Thomas Morrison, commanding a Graves registration platoon from 90th Division, described the work in letters home that his family donated to archives decades later. "We worked 12-hour shifts for 2 weeks straight, German bodies mostly. We buried them in mass graves. There was no alternative. Individual graves for 10,000 dead was impossible. We dug trenches with bulldozers, laid bodies in rows, covered them with earth. I try not to think about it. They were the enemy, but they were also 19-year-old kids. War is supposed to be glorious. This was just industrial-scale death." The mass graves around Chambois, marked with simple wooden crosses, noting Deutsche Soldaten, remained until the 1950s when German war grave services exhumed and reburied the remains in formal military cemeteries. Canadian engineers faced perhaps the most challenging task: clearing roads to allow Allied advance to continue. The Pocket battlefield was not just a memorial site, but an active operational zone. Allied forces needed to move east to pursue retreating Germans, but the roads were blocked by destroyed vehicles that bulldozers had to push aside. A Canadian engineering officer described the process: "We pushed entire tanks into ditches to clear the road. Panthers, Tigers, perfectly good armor, except for empty fuel tanks. We shoved trucks with their loads still inside them into fields. Sometimes we found bodies in the vehicles. Sometimes we didn't have time to check. The war was still happening, and we needed to move forward." This battlefield clearance, performed under time pressure while the campaign continued, meant much evidence of the battle was destroyed or scattered before thorough documentation was possible. Historians' difficulties in establishing precise casualty and equipment figures stem partly from this operational necessity that prioritized movement over preservation. The prisoner of war processing revealed the scope of German losses through human accounting. By August 25th, Allied prisoner cages in the Normandy area held approximately 50,000 German POWs captured during the Pocket operations. They arrived in columns of hundreds, exhausted, demoralized, often wounded, surrendering en masse as organized resistance collapsed. Intelligence officers interviewed them systematically, compiling information about which units had been trapped, which had escaped, who had commanded what, where equipment had been abandoned. These interviews provided the basis for Allied understanding of what the Pocket had achieved. The prisoners represented a cross-section of German military strength, SS elites, Wehrmacht regulars, Luftwaffe ground personnel pressed into infantry roles, Eastern Front veterans, teenage conscripts. The diversity illustrated that Germany had committed its best remaining forces in the West to Normandy and had lost them there. Allied photographic documentation of the Falaise battlefield became some of World War II's most widely distributed images. Signal Corps photographers and British Army film and photo unit cameramen captured thousands of images of the destruction. These photos served multiple purposes: intelligence assessment, historical documentation, propaganda, demonstration of Allied victory, and evidence of German defeat. The images showed burned vehicles in endless columns, dead horses still in their traces, equipment abandoned in panicked flight. Life magazine ran a multi-page spread in September 1944, featuring Falaise photos with minimal text. The images spoke for themselves. The visual record ensured that Falaise became embedded in public consciousness as symbol of Allied triumph and German collapse. Yet the photos, as horrific as they were, could not convey the smell, the sound, or the psychological weight of standing amid such concentrated destruction. The aftermath assessment by Allied commanders mixed satisfaction with frustration. Satisfaction because the Falaise Pocket had clearly inflicted massive damage on German forces, possibly ending their ability to conduct organised defence west of the Seine. Frustration because intelligence estimates suggested 20,000 to 40,000 Germans had escaped through the gap before it closed, taking with them the trained leadership and experienced cadres needed to rebuild divisions. Bradley's August 25th assessment to Eisenhower captured the ambiguity. We have won a great victory. Whether it is as complete as we hoped depends on factors beyond this moment's assessment. Translation: we've badly hurt them, but we haven't destroyed them completely, and the consequences of that partial victory remain to be seen. The debate over whether Falaise was decisive triumph or missed opportunity began immediately and would continue for decades. The French civilian experience of Falaise's aftermath deserves recognition because these were people whose homes became battlefields through no choice of their own. Estimates suggest 1,000 to 2,000 French civilians died in the pocket area during August fighting, killed by artillery, air attack, or caught in crossfire. Thousands more were displaced, returning to towns that no longer existed as functioning communities. Falaise itself was 75% destroyed, only one building in 4 remained habitable. Argentan lost 60% of its structures. Smaller towns like Trun and Chambois suffered similar devastation. For these communities, liberation came at the cost of everything they had built over generations. The rubble had to be cleared, the dead buried, water and sanitation restored, electricity reconnected, roads repaired, all before normal life could resume. Some towns never fully recovered, remaining smaller after the war than before. The military moved on to the next battle. The civilians remained to rebuild from ruins. August 20th, 1944, east of the Seine. SS Obergruppenführer Paul Hauser, commander of 7th Army, lay on a stretcher in a temporary headquarters, his jaw shattered by shrapnel, his army destroyed around him. He had been wounded the previous day during a fighter-bomber attack near Chambois, evacuated barely ahead of the pocket's final collapse. Hauser, one of the original architects of the Waffen-SS, had commanded in Normandy since June and watched his army be systematically dismembered by Allied forces. Yet even in defeat, even wounded and barely able to speak, he had accomplished something remarkable, organising the fighting withdrawal that saved perhaps 30 to 40,000 German soldiers from certain death or capture. The architects of escape were not planners who sat safely in headquarters, but commanders who led from the front, accepted sacrifices, and made brutal decisions about who lived and who died in the collapsing pocket. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps, composed of the 9th and 10th SS Panzer Divisions, had been refitting near Arnhem in Holland when the Normandy crisis erupted. Rushed to France in late July, they arrived too late to prevent the Allied breakout, but just in time to become the fire brigade that held the pocket's western edge while others escaped. These divisions, designated Das Reich and Frundsberg respectively, were veteran Eastern Front formations with experience in desperate battles and fighting withdrawals. Their commanders understood what model needed, not victory, which was impossible, but time, which was purchasable with blood. From August 12th through 20th, they launched repeated counterattacks against Canadian and Polish forces, never succeeding in breaking through, but always succeeding in delaying Allied closure. A Canadian intelligence report from August 18th noted, enemy resistance stiffening, 2nd SS Panzer Corps, identified in multiple sectors. These are first-rate troops fighting with exceptional determination. The tactical organisation of German escape reflected professional competence operating under catastrophic conditions. Regimental commanders established rally points east of Falaise, where scattered units could regroup. Military police set up traffic control at key crossroads, directing columns, preventing bottlenecks, shooting deserters who attempted to flee independently. Engineers prepared crossing points at the Dives and Seine rivers, improvising ferries from whatever materials existed. Supply officers organized distribution points where escaping troops could get minimal food and ammunition. Medical personnel established aid stations to treat wounded capable of continuing. All of this occurred under air attack, under artillery fire, in a pocket shrinking by the hour. That it functioned at all demonstrated the German army's remarkable institutional resilience, even in collapse. That it saved tens of thousands demonstrated that competent leadership could improve even hopeless situations. A German regimental commander's after-action report, captured later, described the organization with clinical precision. Priorities for evacuation. First, headquarters personnel and specialists irreplaceable in short term. Second, combat units with remaining equipment. Third, wounded capable of walking. Fourth, vehicles with fuel and operational capability. Fifth, everything else. Units without vehicles ordered to destroy heavy weapons and escape on foot. Equipment abandoned systematically, with breech blocks removed from artillery, gun tubes spiked, vehicles disabled. Withdrawal conducted in phases. Rearguard holds position X until time Y, then withdraws to position Z. Next unit assumes rearguard. Night movement, maximum daylight concealment. Allied air supremacy makes daylight movement suicidal. These were not the orders of a panicked mob, but of an army executing doctrine under extreme pressure. The German military, for all its political horrors and strategic blunders, retained tactical competence to the end. The Seine River crossings represented the final barrier between encirclement and escape. By August 20th, thousands of Germans who had survived the pocket reached the river to find bridges destroyed and ferries inadequate. They improvised with remarkable creativity. Engineers constructed rafts from doors and wooden planks. Soldiers swam the river holding weapons above water. Wounded men floated across on makeshift platforms. Vehicles that couldn't be ferried were pushed into the river to deny them to the Allies. One German account describes a panzer regiment. We had 12 tanks reach the Seine. We ferried the crews across. We sank the tanks in the river after removing essential parts. By August 25th, all personnel were across. We had saved the men. The equipment was gone, but men can be re-equipped. This calculation, trading irreplaceable equipment for replaceable men, reversed normal military logic but reflected German strategic reality in late 1944. Germany had factories that could build tanks. It no longer had unlimited manpower. Field Marshal Model's August 25th conference at his new headquarters assembled the survivors and made brutal assessments. Which divisions still existed as military formations, which had been destroyed so completely that their designations should be retired? Which commanders had performed well enough to deserve new assignments? Which units could be rebuilt and which should be cannibalized for personnel? Model's notes from this conference show cold calculation. 2nd Panzer Division, cadre survives, can be rebuilt. 1/16th Panzer Division, destroyed. Disband and distribute survivors to other formations. 300 survivors from 20,000, designate as battalion, and rebuild gradually. 9th SS Panzer, sufficient cadre exists, priority for replacement. These decisions determined which German divisions would appear in later battles. Units that escaped the pocket largely intact became formation names at Arnhem in the Ardennes on the Rhine. Units destroyed completely disappeared from order of battle. The survival rate of German leadership deserves analysis because it had strategic consequences. Divisional and corps commanders escaped at much higher rates than ordinary soldiers. They had vehicles, fuel priority, better information about escape routes, and staff devoted to ensuring their survival. This was not cowardice, but calculation. Trained commanders were more valuable than individual soldiers, yet it meant German armies could reconstitute command structures faster than combat strength. The cadres Model referenced were not just experienced soldiers, but intact command teams who could train replacements. A German division in September might have only 30% of its June strength, but it would have its original commander, operations officer, many company commanders, and experienced sergeants. This leadership continuity enabled surprisingly rapid rebuilding of combat capability given time and replacement personnel. Comparison to Stalingrad illuminates what Falaise achieved and what it failed to achieve. At Stalingrad, winter 1942-43, the Soviet Red Army surrounded German 6th Army, 330,000 men, and destroyed it almost completely. Only 6,000 survivors eventually returned to Germany from Soviet captivity. Stalingrad destroyed not just equipment but personnel, not just divisions but entire corps, not just soldiers but potential cadres for reconstruction. The encirclement was total, the destruction nearly absolute, the strategic consequences immediate. Falaise, by contrast, destroyed perhaps 60 to 70% of trapped forces, a serious defeat, but not complete annihilation. The 30 to 40% who escaped provided the nucleus for rebuilt divisions. Stalingrad removed the German 6th Army from the order of battle permanently. Falaise removed 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army temporarily. The difference would matter in coming months. The speed of German recovery shocked Allied intelligence officers who tracked German movements east of the Seine. On September 5th, barely 2 weeks after the pocket closed, Allied intelligence identified at least 8 German divisions along the West Wall, Germany's defensive fortifications on its western border. Estimated strength, 100,000 troops. By September 15th, that number had grown to 55 divisions in the west. Many were under strength, poorly equipped, and composed of hastily trained replacements. But they existed. They occupied defensive positions. They would fight. The divisions that had survived Falaise provided the framework around which this defensive line was built. Without those survivors, without the cadres that escaped, the German position in September would have been catastrophically weaker. Model's brutal pragmatism, save the cadres, accept equipment losses, rebuild quickly, had worked just well enough to continue the war. The human cost of being an architect of escape deserves acknowledgement. Hauser survived his wounds but never held field command again. Von Kluge committed suicide rather than face Hitler's accusations of disloyalty. Model would command brilliantly for another 8 months before committing suicide in the Ruhr Pocket in April 1945 rather than surrender. Junior commanders who held the rearguard actions battalion and regimental commanders died in disproportionate numbers. The officers who enabled escape often didn't escape themselves, sacrificing their lives to buy time for others. This was not noble in the abstract sense, they fought for a criminal regime, but it was professionally competent and personally brave. War creates moral complexities where enemy soldiers can be simultaneously accomplices to evil and examples of courage under impossible conditions. The architects of escape operated in that morally ambiguous space where tactical competence served strategic evil but also saved individual lives that might have been lost otherwise. August 21st, 1944, SHA-F headquarters, Dwight D. Eisenhower sat with his chief of staff, General Walter Bedell Smith, reviewing intelligence summaries that quantified the Falaise victory in cold numbers: 10,000 Germans confirmed dead, 50,000 captured, perhaps 40,000 escaped, 700 tanks destroyed or captured, 2,000 vehicles eliminated. The statistics represented a major victory by any objective standard. An entire German army group shattered, equipment losses that would take months to replace, Allied forces now racing toward the Seine and beyond. Yet Eisenhower's satisfaction was tempered by a nagging question that would haunt historical debates for decades. Could they have done better? Should American forces have pushed beyond Argentan to Falaise, closing the gap 3 or 4 days earlier? Would that have trapped another 20,000 Germans, shortened the war, saved Allied lives in future battles? The Supreme Commander faced every commander's most difficult challenge, assessing decisions made in the fog of war with the clarity of hindsight. The immediate post-battle conference on August 21st brought together the key Allied commanders, Montgomery, Bradley, and Patton, with Eisenhower presiding. The meeting's official purpose was planning the pursuit beyond the Seine. Its unofficial purpose was assigning credit and deflecting blame for the Gap controversy. Montgomery opened with a presentation emphasizing the victory's scale. We have destroyed the German army in France. Their fighting power west of the Rhine is broken. We have achieved what we set out to accomplish. The statement was not inaccurate, but it was incomplete. Bradley followed with his own assessment, carefully diplomatic. The boundary decision at Argentan was made for sound tactical reasons. We avoided a collision between Allied forces, and we held a strong shoulder against German breakout attempts. Again, not false, but not the complete picture. Patton, when his turn came, was characteristically direct. We should have closed at Falaise on August 13th. We had the forces, we had the position, we chose not to act. The tension in the room was palpable. Eisenhower's role as Supreme Commander required him to maintain Allied unity above all other considerations. The Anglo-American alliance was always fragile, held together by common enemies rather than natural affinity. British and American forces had different combat doctrines, different national objectives, different military traditions. Montgomery and Patton personally despised each other with an intensity that made professional cooperation difficult. Bradley distrusted Montgomery's caution. Montgomery resented American numerical superiority that was shifting operational control away from British commanders. Into this volatile mix, Eisenhower had to inject decisions that preserved coalition functionality while achieving military objectives. At Falaise, the boundary decision reflected this political reality as much as military calculation. Better a partial victory that kept the alliance functioning than a complete victory that shattered Allied cooperation and made future operations impossible. The historical debate that would emerge in coming years crystallized around three distinct interpretations. The first, primarily advanced by American historians and Patton supporters, argued that Bradley erred by stopping at Argentan. American forces should have pushed to Falaise regardless of boundary agreements, closing the gap by August 13th or 14th and trapping perhaps 70 to 80% of German forces instead of 60 to 70%. The second interpretation, favoured by British historians and Montgomery's defenders, argued that Canadian forces' slow advance from Caen was the real problem. If they had reached Falaise by August 10th as planned, the gap would have closed before Americans even reached Argentan, making the boundary question moot. The third interpretation, representing emerging consensus among later historians, argued both commanders shared responsibility for a partially successful encirclement that achieved significant but not decisive results. Chester Wilmot's 1952 book, The Struggle for Europe, ignited public controversy by explicitly criticising American decision-making at Falaise. Wilmot, an Australian journalist who had covered the campaign, argued that Bradley's boundary decision reflected political deference to Montgomery rather than sound military judgment, and that American caution at Argentan contrasted poorly with aggressive pursuit elsewhere. The book became a bestseller in Britain and generated furious responses from American veterans and historians who viewed it as unfairly diminishing American contributions to victory. Bradley published his memoir, A Soldier's Story, in 1951, partly to defend his decisions, arguing that the boundary prevented friendly fire casualties and that ultimate victory vindicated his caution. The debate moved from military journals to popular histories, from professional assessment to national pride, becoming less about what actually happened and more about which nation deserved more credit for Allied victory. Eisenhower's own post-war memoir, Crusade in Europe, published in 1948, navigated the controversy with careful diplomacy. He defended the boundary decision as reasonable, given the information available at the time, praised both American and British forces for their contributions, and avoided explicitly criticising any subordinate commander. Yet in private correspondence, preserved in his presidential library, Eisenhower expressed doubts. A 1953 letter to Bradley acknowledged, in retrospect, pushing beyond Argentan might have been worth the risk of collision. The potential gain trapping 20,000 more Germans probably outweighed the potential cost of friendly fire incidents. This represented about as close as Eisenhower ever came to second-guessing the decision, and even then he framed it hypothetically rather than as definite criticism. The logistical reality, often overlooked in strategic debates, was that by late August, Allied forces were outrunning their supply lines regardless of Falaise's outcome. The breakout from Normandy had been so rapid that fuel and ammunition couldn't keep pace with advancing armies. Trucks that should have been carrying supplies to forward units were instead stuck in traffic jams stretching back to Normandy beaches. The port of Cherbourg, captured in June, couldn't handle the volume needed. Antwerp, captured in early September, wouldn't become operational until November because the Scheldt estuary remained in German hands. This supply crisis, sometimes called the tyranny of logistics, meant Allied armies would have slowed in September regardless of how many Germans escaped at Falaise. Even complete destruction of German forces in the pocket wouldn't have enabled a 1944 advance to Berlin because Allied armies literally didn't have the fuel to get there. The question of whether complete encirclement at Falaise would have ended the war in 1944 requires examining German force structure across all fronts. In August 1944, Germany maintained approximately 330 divisions, 190 on the Eastern Front, 60 in Italy and the Balkans, 55 in the West, 25 in Scandinavia and elsewhere. Destroying an additional 20,000 soldiers in France, the difference between partial and complete success at Falaise would have eliminated perhaps 2 or 3 divisions worth of personnel from the Western Front. Significant, certainly. War ending, unlikely. Germany would have retreated to the West Wall earlier, with weaker forces, but the fundamental strategic situation, Germany fighting desperately on interior lines, willing to sacrifice everything rather than surrender, would not have changed. The war might have ended weeks or months earlier, but not years earlier, and probably not in 1944. Bradley's diary entries from late August, declassified decades later, reveal a commander wrestling with decisions weight. August 22nd, visited the battlefield. The destruction is total, yet intelligence estimates suggest 30 to 40,000 escaped. Could we have done better? Should I have authorized movement beyond Argentan? In the moment, with the information available, I made the decision that seemed right. Now, looking at what they accomplished with those who escaped, I wonder, these private doubts never appeared in his public statements, which consistently defended the boundary decision. The contrast between public confidence and private uncertainty characterized many commanders' retrospective assessments. In the moment, with incomplete information and pressure to decide quickly, choices seemed clear. Afterward, with full information and time for reflection, those same choices appeared more ambiguous. Montgomery's perspective, expressed in his own memoirs and in later interviews, maintained consistent certainty that British and Canadian forces had performed brilliantly under difficult conditions. He acknowledged the Canadian advance to Falaise took longer than planned, but attributed this to unexpectedly fierce German resistance rather than operational failures. He praised Polish forces for their heroic stand at Maczuga. He noted that British and Canadian casualties during the Falaise operations, approximately 7,000, demonstrated the intensity of combat his forces faced. And he argued that the ultimate encirclement, even if delayed, achieved its strategic purpose of destroying German combat power in France. Montgomery never publicly admitted error or doubt about Falaise, maintaining the confidence that was simultaneously his greatest strength as a commander and his greatest weakness in coalition warfare. The human dimension of the command debate, the soldiers who died because of delayed closure, the soldiers who survived because of careful coordination, resists easy quantification. If the gap had closed 3 days earlier, perhaps 5,000 more Germans would have been captured or killed. But how many Allied soldiers would have died in friendly fire incidents if American and Canadian forces met in confused combat around Falaise? How many additional casualties would Americans have taken pushing north against whatever German forces held that sector? The moral calculus of war, trading lives, calculating acceptable casualties, deciding whose deaths are worthwhile, defies clean answers. Commanders make decisions, soldiers die. Some deaths prevent other deaths, some deaths accomplish nothing. Separating one from the other requires knowledge that doesn't exist at decision time. This is why command is burden as much as authority, why generals' memoirs so often defend decisions that look different in hindsight, why the Falaise debate continued for generations. There were no definitively correct answers, only decisions that seemed best given what was known when they had to be made. September 5th, 1944, Allied Intelligence Headquarters. Staff officers stared at reconnaissance reports with expressions mixing disbelief and professional alarm. The reports described German defensive positions along the West Wall, the fortification line Germany had built along its western frontier in the 1930s. What alarmed the intelligence officers wasn't that Germans were retreating to the West Wall that was expected, but that they were doing so in organised formations with evident command structure. Estimates suggested 8 divisions already in position, perhaps 100,000 troops, with more arriving daily. This contradicted expectations that the German army in the West had been destroyed beyond rapid reconstitution. A lieutenant colonel reviewing the reports commented to his superior, 3 weeks ago we were counting their dead at Falaise, now they're building a defensive line. How is this possible? The answer lay in the escaped cadres, the German military's remarkable institutional resilience, and Allied failure to maintain pursuit pressure during the critical late August period. The reconstruction of German forces after Falaise demonstrated organisational capabilities that Allied commanders had underestimated. The Wehrmacht's system of replacement and training, honed through 5 years of war, could rapidly integrate new personnel into existing formations if experienced cadres survived. Those 30 to 40,000 Germans who escaped the pocket included disproportionate numbers of officers, NCOs, and specialists, the leadership framework around which divisions could be rebuilt. Germany's replacement training system continued producing soldiers even as fronts collapsed. Luftwaffe ground personnel, previously exempt from ground combat, were now being pressed into infantry roles. Volkssturm, the people's militia of older men and teenagers, began forming, and German factories continued producing weapons and equipment at rates that, while declining, still supported new formations. By early September, these elements combined to create something Allied intelligence hadn't anticipated. A new defensive line manned by formations that, while weaker than their predecessors, could still offer organized resistance. The specific divisions that appeared on Allied intelligence maps in early September told the story of survival and reconstitution. 2nd Panzer Division, which had lost most of its equipment at Falaise, reappeared with new tanks drawn from production and training units. 116th Panzer Division, similarly depleted, received replacements and equipment sufficient to field a combat-capable Kampfgruppe battle group. 9th SS Panzer Division, which had fought the rearguard action enabling others' escape, reformed around its surviving nucleus with fresh troops. These were not the powerful formations of June, but neither were they the destroyed wrecks of late August. A British intelligence assessment from September 10th noted, "Enemy has demonstrated remarkable powers of recovery. Units assessed as destroyed in August have reappeared with reduced but significant combat capability. We face an enemy, wounded but not finished." The key enabler of German recovery was time, specifically the week to 10 days in late August and early September when Allied pursuit slowed due to supply shortages. The fuel crisis that had been building since the breakout from Normandy reached critical levels by late August. Patton's Third Army, which had raced across France, consuming fuel at unsustainable rates, began running dry. British Second Army faced similar shortages. The advance that had covered hundreds of miles in August suddenly stalled within sight of Germany's border. This pause, operationally necessary from Allied perspective, was strategically invaluable from German perspective. It gave them time to establish defensive positions, integrate replacements, deploy newly formed units, and create a coherent front line where none had existed days earlier. If Allied forces had maintained continuous pressure, accepting fuel shortages and supply difficulties, German reconstruction would have been far more difficult. The pause allowed recovery. A German infantry company commander's diary from early September illustrated the reconstitution process at ground level. September 7th, company reforms with 53 men, 38 are replacements who arrived yesterday from training battalion, average age 19. Most have never been in combat. Our experienced soldiers, 15 men who survived France, will serve as squad leaders and try to teach the new ones how to survive. Adequate rifles and machine guns, limited ammunition, no heavy weapons yet. Occupy west wall bunkers and prepare defensive positions. The young replacements are eager. The veterans are exhausted. We will do what we must. This pattern repeated across hundreds of companies, a few survivors providing backbone, while masses of inexperienced troops filled ranks. The resulting formations were brittle compared to veteran divisions, but capable of defensive combat, particularly in fortified positions. The West Wall itself, called the Siegfried Line by the Allies, provided Germany an invaluable defensive advantage. Built in the 1930s, the fortification system consisted of thousands of bunkers, anti-tank obstacles called Dragon's Teeth, minefields, and prepared defensive positions stretching from the Swiss border to the Netherlands. Much had been neglected during Germany's offensive years, when the West Wall seemed unnecessary, but the basic infrastructure remained. German engineers worked frantically through late August and early September to reactivate positions, clear firing lanes, lay fresh minefields, and prepare defences. Combined with the difficult terrain of the German frontier rivers, forests, hills, the West Wall transformed the tactical situation. Allied forces that had been pursuing across open French countryside now faced prepared defences in restricted terrain. The nature of combat changed from mobile warfare back to siege warfare, favouring the defender. Allied forces discovered the changed situation through painful experience. British XXX Corps, pushing toward the Rhine in early September, encountered what they expected to be disorganised German remnants, and instead found prepared defensive positions manned by troops willing to fight. The Guards Armoured Division, attacking toward Eindhoven on September 12th, reported enemy resistance stiffening, encountering prepared defences with anti-tank guns and concrete emplacements. Progress slower than anticipated. American forces advancing toward the Siegfried Line near Aachen had similar experiences. 1st Infantry Division, attacking German border positions on September 13th, suffered significant casualties taking bunkers that were supposed to have been unmanned. The surprise wasn't that Germans were defending Germany that was expected, but that they were doing so in formations with unit cohesion and command structure intact, only 3 weeks after the disaster at Falaise. Field Marshal Walter Model's September 15th report to Hitler, captured in archives, quantified the recovery. We have established a continuous front from Switzerland to the Channel. Current strength, 55 divisions, aggregate personnel, approximately 700,000. Equipment status, 25% of June levels for armour, 40% for artillery, 60% for small arms. Combat effectiveness, 30 to 40% of pre-Normandy strength. Assessment, we cannot attack, but we can defend. The West Wall provides time to rebuild. We have stopped the Allied advance. Model, known as the Führer's fireman, for his ability to stabilise collapsing fronts, had achieved something remarkable. In 6 weeks, he had taken the wreckage of Falaise and created a functioning defensive front. It would not win the war that was already impossible, but it would prolong the war, which from German perspective was the only remaining option. The strategic implications of German recovery were profound and immediate. Allied commanders, particularly Montgomery, had planned operations assuming German forces would remain disorganized through autumn. Operation Market Garden, the airborne assault on Arnhem, scheduled for mid-September, was premised on German weakness and Allied strength. The plan assumed lightly defended bridges, disorganized German response, and rapid advance by ground forces. Reality, shaped by German recovery that Allied intelligence had underestimated, would prove catastrophically different. The divisions that escaped Falaise, rebuilt and redeployed, would destroy the Arnhem operation. The time granted by Allied supply problems would enable German preparation that doomed Allied hopes for a 1944 victory. The question of whether complete destruction at Falaise would have prevented German recovery requires counterfactual analysis. If the additional 20 to 30,000 Germans who escaped had instead been captured or killed, would the West Wall have remained undefended? Probably not. Germany would have formed new divisions from training replacements and Luftwaffe personnel regardless. Would those divisions have been less effective without experienced cadres? Almost certainly, unit cohesion and leadership quality would have been significantly lower. Would this have enabled Allied breakthrough in September? Possibly weaker German defences might have collapsed under pressure that in actual history held. The margin between Allied success and failure in autumn 1944 was narrow enough that eliminating several experienced German divisions might have tipped the balance, or it might not have. The supply crisis alone might have stopped Allied advance, regardless of German strength. Historical certainty about counterfactuals is impossible, but the correlation between incomplete Falaise encirclement and German September recovery is clear, even if causation remains debatable. The human cost of German recovery measured in Allied casualties during battles that might not have been necessary remains incalculable but real. Market Garden would cost over 15,000 Allied casualties in a week. The Hürtgen Forest battles would consume tens of thousands more over 3 months. The Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, would kill or wound over 80,000 Americans in December. Not all of these casualties resulted from German recovery after Falaise. The war would have continued regardless. But some fraction of those men, how many we cannot know, died fighting German soldiers who escaped the pocket in August and returned to combat in autumn. This is the true cost of incomplete victory. Not just enemy forces that escaped, but friendly forces who died in subsequent battles because the enemy survived to fight again. Military decisions have cascading consequences that extend far beyond the immediate battlefield. The boundary line at Argentan, the delay reaching Falaise, the gap that remained open, these tactical choices made in August shaped battles fought in September, October, November. The chain of causation runs through the entire campaign. September 4th, 1944, Field Marshal Montgomery's tactical headquarters. Maps covered the walls, showing Allied positions stretched in a long salient from Normandy to Brussels, which had been liberated the previous day. Montgomery studied these maps with an intensity that suggested he was seeing not just current positions but future possibilities. The liberation of Brussels and Antwerp had created unexpected opportunities. German forces appeared disorganized. The border of Germany lay tantalizingly close. And Montgomery, whose reputation had suffered from criticisms about slow progress since D-Day, saw a chance for a bold stroke that would vindicate his methods and end the war in 1944. He began sketching a plan. Airborne forces would seize bridges across the Rhine and its tributaries in Holland, ground forces would advance up a single highway to relieve them, and the Allies would have a route into Germany's industrial Ruhr region. It was audacious, risky, and completely contrary to Montgomery's usual methodical caution, but circumstances seemed to justify extraordinary measures, also he believed. Operation Market Garden, as the plan became known, required execution on a scale unprecedented in airborne operations. 3.5 airborne divisions, American 82nd and 101st, British 1st Airborne, Polish 1st Independent Parachute Brigade, would drop along a 60-mile corridor from Eindhoven to Arnhem. They would seize bridges at Eindhoven, Nijmegen, and Arnhem, holding them until British XXX Corps advanced up the single highway linking these towns. The distances were vast, the coordination complex, the risks obvious, but Montgomery believed German forces in Holland were too weak to mount effective resistance, that surprise would enable the airborne troops to seize their objectives before Germans could react, and that ground forces could cover 60 miles in 2 to 3 days. The plan was briefed to Eisenhower on September 10th and approved despite reservations from several commanders who thought it too ambitious. Market Garden was scheduled for September 17th, barely 2 weeks after conception. In the rush to exploit apparent German weakness, intelligence suggesting otherwise was discounted or ignored. The intelligence failure that doomed Market Garden began with assessment errors in early September. Allied intelligence, conditioned by Falaise to view German forces as shattered remnants, interpreted every sign of German recovery through that lens. Reports of SS Panzer divisions near Arnhem were dismissed as scattered remnants refitting after France, not combat-capable formations. Reconnaissance photos showing German armour in woods near landing zones were interpreted as evidence of retreat, not preparation for combat. Dutch resistance reports about German troop concentrations were discounted as exaggerated. The intelligence picture presented to commanders emphasized German weakness and minimized German strength, because that's what Allied commanders expected and wanted to hear. Major Brian Urquhart, British intelligence officer who raised concerns about German armour near Arnhem, was sent on medical leave for stress. His warnings, which later proved accurate, were ignored because they contradicted the narrative of German collapse. September 17th, 1944, 1300 hours. The largest airborne operation in history began as transport aircraft filled Dutch skies. American paratroopers jumped over Eindhoven and Nijmegen. British paratroopers and Polish glider troops landed near Arnhem. The operations were tactically successful initially. Most units landed in correct locations, seized initial objectives, established defensive perimeters. Then German reaction revealed the catastrophic intelligence failure. The SS formations that Allied intelligence had dismissed as non-threatening responded with shocking speed and effectiveness. 9th SS Panzer Division and 10th SS Panzer Division, the same formations that had held the western edge of the Falaise Pocket and enabled German escape, were refitting near Arnhem and immediately committed to combat. British paratroopers found themselves fighting veteran SS Panzer troops instead of demoralised remnants. The battle for Arnhem Bridge, which should have been a brief holding action before relief arrived, became a desperate siege. The connection between Falaise and Arnhem becomes clear through unit lineage. The 9th and 10th SS Panzer divisions that defended Arnhem had been part of 2nd SS Panzer Corps during the Normandy campaign. They had fought to keep the Falaise Pocket's western edge open. They had sacrificed equipment and personnel to buy time for others to escape. They had withdrawn across the Seine, battered but intact in terms of leadership and organisation. Through August and early September, they had absorbed replacement personnel and equipment, rebuilding combat strength around the experienced cadres that survived Falaise. By mid-September, they were not at full strength, perhaps 30 to 40% of June capabilities, but they were coherent military formations under experienced commanders. Without their survival at Falaise, without the time Allied supply problems granted for recovery, they would not have been near Arnhem in combat-ready condition. The causal chain from incomplete encirclement to operational disaster runs directly through these divisions. British XXX Corps, advancing up Hell's Highway to relieve the airborne forces, faced opposition that made the planned 2 to 3 day advance impossible. The single highway, really just a two-lane road raised above Dutch marshland, became a killing ground where German forces holding the flanks could attack the advancing column with impunity. Traffic jams developed, vehicles disabled by German fire blocked the road. Weather turned poor, grounding air support. The advance that should have reached Arnhem by September 19th instead stalled repeatedly, reaching only as far as Nijmegen by September 20th. British paratroopers at Arnhem, surrounded and running out of ammunition, held the northern end of Arnhem Bridge against overwhelming German attacks. They radioed desperately for relief that wasn't coming. On September 25th, after 9 days of combat, the survivors withdrew across the Rhine. Of 10,005 British airborne troops who landed near Arnhem, only 2,400 escaped. The rest were dead or captured. The casualty accounting for Market Garden illustrated how incomplete victory at Falaise translated into disaster at Arnhem. Allied casualties: approximately 15,300 killed, wounded, captured, missing. Of these, over 8,000 were British 1st Airborne Division paratroopers, effectively destroying the division as a combat formation. American casualties at Nijmegen and along Hell's Highway added several thousand more. Polish casualties, particularly among the paratroopers who dropped near Arnhem, were proportionally severe. Against these losses, the operation achieved partial success. Bridges at Eindhoven and Nijmegen were captured and held. Allied forces advanced 60 miles into Holland. An salient was created that provided a base for later operations. But the main objective, crossing the Rhine at Arnhem, failed completely. The operation intended to end the war in 1944 instead consumed resources and time that made a 1944 victory impossible. A British intelligence officer's retrospective analysis, written in October 1944 and declassified decades later, made explicit connections. The intelligence failure at Market Garden stemmed from our misassessment of German recovery capabilities. We assumed Falaise had destroyed German military effectiveness for months. We were wrong. German formations that escaped the pocket in August were combat capable in September. Specifically, 2nd SS Panzer Corps' presence near Arnhem was not coincidence but consequence of our failure to completely destroy them in France. We did not know they had reformed because we assumed they could not reform. This assumption cost us Arnhem. The analysis was brutal in its honesty, but too late to affect decisions. The pattern it identified, underestimating German resilience, overestimating Allied advantages, assuming incomplete victories were complete, would repeat through autumn and winter campaigns. The time cost of Market Garden's failure extended beyond the week of actual combat. The operation consumed supplies and attention from early September through late September, delaying other operations. Most critically, it delayed clearing the Scheldt estuary to open Antwerp port. Antwerp had been captured on September 4th, with its port facilities intact, but the city was useless for supply purposes, while Germans held both sides of the Scheldt estuary leading to it. Opening Antwerp required amphibious assaults and sustained combat that Montgomery postponed in favour of Market Garden. Antwerp didn't become operational until late November, 2.5 months after its capture. This delay perpetuated the supply crisis that had enabled German recovery in the first place. If Antwerp had been opened in September, Allied forces might have had the logistical support for sustained offensive operations in October and November. Instead, they spent those months fighting battles enabled by earlier delays in a cascade of consequences stretching back to August. The strategic question historians still debate is whether complete destruction at Falaise would have prevented Arnhem's failure. The chain of causation suggests yes, if the additional 20,000 Germans had been captured rather than escaped, if the SS Panzer divisions had been destroyed rather than preserved, if German recovery had been delayed by weeks rather than days, then Market Garden might have encountered the weak opposition Allied intelligence predicted, rather than the strong resistance they actually faced. But counterfactual certainty is impossible. Even without those specific SS divisions, Germany might have assembled other forces to defend Arnhem. The single road advance might have failed for logistical reasons regardless of opposition. Whether that grounded air support might have doomed the operation even against weaker enemies. What is certain is that the German forces that destroyed Market Garden were direct descendants in terms of unit lineage and personnel of forces that escaped Falaise. The connection is clear, even if alternative outcomes remain speculative. The human stories from Arnhem connected back to Falaise in unexpected ways. British paratroopers who died at Arnhem Bridge might have lived if the SS troops attacking them had been captured in France. German soldiers who killed Allied troops at Nijmegen had themselves nearly died at Chambois 6 weeks earlier. The Polish paratroopers who fought at Arnhem served in the same division that had held Maczuga during Falaise, survivors of one impossible battle dying in another. War creates these connections, battles, separated by weeks and hundreds of miles linked through the men who fought them, through decisions that cascaded across time and space, through incomplete victories that enabled future defeats. Falaise and Arnhem were different battles in different countries with different objectives, but they were connected through the continuous thread of campaign, through the men who fought both, through the consequences of what happened and what didn't happen in Norman fields during August 1944. Toronto, Canada, August 28th, 1944. Margaret Anderson opened her apartment door to find a Western Union messenger standing there with an envelope. She knew before opening it. Every wife, every mother, every sister knew. The telegram's language was bureaucratic in its brevity. The Minister of National Defence deeply regrets to inform you that Corporal James Robert Anderson was killed in action on August 14th, 1944, in the vicinity of Falaise, France. Letter follows. Sincere sympathy. 23 words to communicate that her husband would never walk through that door again, that their 2-year-old daughter would never remember her father, that the future they had planned ceased to exist on some Norman battlefield whose name she had never heard. Margaret Anderson was one of thousands who received similar telegrams in late August and early September, one face in the vast human ledger, where wars are ultimately counted not in divisions destroyed or territory captured, but in individual lives ended or shattered. Corporal James Anderson had been killed on Verrières Ridge during Operation Totalize, cut down by machine gun fire while advancing with his platoon toward German positions. He was 24 years old, had enlisted in 1942, trained in England for 18 months, landed in Normandy on July 8th as a replacement, and survived exactly 5 weeks of combat. His story was unremarkable in its particulars. Thousands of Allied soldiers died in similar circumstances, but that very commonality illustrated war's human cost. Each casualty was someone's son or husband or father. Each death destroyed futures, shattered families, left grief that would echo through generations. The strategic debates about boundaries and encirclement, the arguments over who deserved credit or blame, meant nothing to Margaret Anderson holding a telegram that reduced her life to before and after that moment. German casualties at Falaise were even more poorly documented than Allied losses because German record-keeping collapsed as units were destroyed. A 19-year-old Hitler-Jugend soldier named Klaus Hoffmann, captured near Chambois on August 19th, gave an interview to Allied interrogators that preserved his story. He had joined the 12th SS Panzer Division in May as a replacement, trained for 3 weeks, sent to Normandy in June. His platoon of 40 men was reduced to 12 by early August through steady attrition. Those 12 fought together through the withdrawal, through the shrinking pocket, through the final desperate attempts to escape. On August 18th, they were caught by Allied artillery near the corridor. Hoffmann watched his squad leader, a veteran of the Eastern Front who had survived 2 years of combat, torn apart by shrapnel. The remaining 11 scattered. Hoffmann hid in a ditch for 12 hours, surrounded by dead horses and burning vehicles. When he finally emerged and surrendered, he was the only survivor from his original 40-man platoon. He cried during the interrogation, not from fear of captivity but from grief for friends who were dead and guilt that he had survived. American medics working in forward aid stations during the Falaise battles described treating wounded that revealed the war's true face. Captain Robert Hayes, medical officer with the 90th Infantry Division, kept notes that his family donated to archives decades later. August 20th, treated German wounded all day. Most are teenagers. They ask for their mothers before they die, just like our boys do. One boy couldn't have been more than 17, had both legs blown off by our artillery. He lived about 30 minutes. He kept apologizing to me in broken English, saying he was sorry. Sorry for what? For being German? For surviving this long? For dying? I held his hand until he stopped breathing. I don't know his name. He's recorded as enemy wounded, died of injuries, but he was a kid who should have been in school, not bleeding out in a French barn. These small human moments, repeated thousands of times across the battlefield, never appeared in official histories but constituted war's actual substance. The psychological casualties men whose bodies survived but whose minds were shattered received little attention in 1944, but were as real as physical wounds. Post-traumatic stress disorder wasn't recognized as a diagnosis until decades later, but it existed in 1944 under names like battle fatigue and combat exhaustion. Canadian psychiatrists attached to Second Corps treated hundreds of soldiers during and after the Falaise battles who exhibited symptoms we now recognize as PTSD, inability to sleep, violent nightmares, panic reactions to loud noises, emotional detachment, survivor's guilt. Some recovered enough to return to duty. Others were evacuated to rear area hospitals and eventually to Canada, their combat service ended by invisible wounds that were every bit as disabling as missing limbs. A psychiatric report from September 1944 noted soldiers who fought through the Falaise corridor present with trauma symptoms comparable to veterans of prolonged siege warfare. The concentration of destruction and death in that restricted space has produced psychological casualties at rates exceeding our capacity to treat them. Polish forces at Maczuga suffered casualties that were both numerically severe and symbolically profound. These were exiled soldiers fighting to liberate Europe from the same tyranny that had destroyed their homeland. Many knew they would never return to Poland. The advancing Red Army meant Soviet domination, not liberation. They fought anyway, accepting losses that devastated their ranks. The division's casualty figures for the Falaise operation: 325 killed, 1,002 wounded, 175 missing, a total of 1,500 casualties from 16,000 men, nearly 10% in a week. These numbers included the division commander's son, killed on Maczuga. They included men who had escaped Poland in 1939, fought in France in 1940, evacuated to Britain, trained for 4 years, and died in their first major battle. For Polish soldiers, Falaise represented both military necessity and national tragedy, necessary sacrifice in a larger cause, but sacrifice that bled a nation already bled dry by occupation and deportation. Civilian casualties in the Falaise region received minimal attention during the battle, but represented tragedy on a scale that devastated Norman communities. Estimates suggest 1,000 to 2,000 French civilians died during August fighting in the Pocket area, killed by artillery, airstrikes, or caught in crossfire. Thousands more were wounded. Entire families died together in cellars that collapsed from bomb impacts. Children were orphaned. Old people who had survived the First World War did not survive the Second. The town of Falaise lost approximately 200 civilians. Argentan lost similar numbers. Smaller villages lost proportionally more. These were not combatants, but farmers, shopkeepers, teachers, children who happened to live where armies decided to fight. Their names don't appear in military casualty lists. Their deaths were recorded by French civil authorities, if recorded at all, and their stories were overshadowed by military narratives. But they died just as certainly as the soldiers, and their families grieved just as profoundly. A Canadian veteran's 1984 return to the battlefield, commemorating the 40th anniversary, illustrated how Falaise's human cost echoed through decades. Sergeant Thomas Morrison, who had fought with the Highland Light Infantry through the entire Normandy campaign, travelled to Chambois for anniversary ceremonies. He walked roads where his unit had fought, visited the Montgomery Memorial, stood on Maczuga, looking down at the corridor. When asked by a journalist what he remembered most about the battle, Morrison paused for a long moment before answering, "The smell. 40 years later, and I can still smell it. Bodies and horses in summer heat. You never forget that smell. It's what wakes me up at night sometimes. Even now, we try to remember the victory, the liberation, the bravery. But what I actually remember is the smell of death." His response captured something official histories couldn't, that war's human cost extends beyond casualty statistics into permanent psychological scars carried by survivors for the rest of their lives. The question of whether the casualties were worth the victory is unanswerable but unavoidable. Allied casualties, Canadian, British, American, Polish, totaled approximately 9,000 killed and wounded during the Falaise operations. From August 1st through 21st, German casualties totaled approximately 10,000 killed and 50,000 captured in the Pocket area, with perhaps 5,000 to 8,000 additional killed attempting to escape. Civilian casualties add another 1,000 to 2,000. Against these 70,000 casualties, the operation achieved significant but incomplete success. German forces in France were severely damaged but not destroyed. Equipment losses were heavy, but personnel escaped to fight again. the war continued, but under worse conditions for Germany. Were these casualties necessary? Would different decisions have achieved better results with fewer losses? Could complete encirclement have shortened the war enough to justify the risks? These questions have no definitive answers, only competing interpretations, shaped by how one weighs lives against objectives, means against ends, tactical choices against strategic outcomes. The memorials erected after the war attempted to honour the dead without resolving debates about their death's meaning. The Montgomery Memorial, opened in 1994 for the 50th anniversary, lists names of Polish, Canadian, American, French, British soldiers who died in the battle. Across the valley sits a German military cemetery with thousands of graves, most marked Ein Deutscher Soldat, a German soldier, because the dead were never identified. The physical proximity of Allied and German graves mirrors the moral complexity of commemorating battles where both sides suffered, where victory and defeat don't map neatly onto good and evil, where soldiers on both sides died for causes they may or may not have understood or agreed with. Visiting these memorials forces confrontation with war's fundamental tragedy, that achieving necessary military objectives required the deaths of thousands of individuals who each had names, families, futures that were destroyed in pursuit of national goals. They had little choice in serving. Falaise, France, August 18th, 1944. Marie Duclos emerged from the cellar where her family had sheltered for 13 days and confronted a reality that exceeded her worst imaginings. The medieval town where she had lived her entire 43 years no longer existed in any recognizable form. The bakery where her father had worked, rubble. The church where she had been married, the nave collapsed, only the bell tower still standing. Her own home, the front wall gone, interior exposed like a cutaway doll's house, furniture visible on the second floor but no staircase to reach it. Bodies lay in the streets, covered hastily with whatever fabric could be found. The smell of death and smoke hung so thick it was almost visible. And in the town square, Canadian soldiers were distributing food to the few dozen civilians who had survived, trying to organise evacuation of a town that was no longer a town but an archaeological site of its own destruction. Liberation had come, but liberation looked like the end of the world. The physical destruction of Norman towns in the Falaise Pocket area was so complete that post-war reconstruction essentially meant rebuilding from foundations. Falaise itself suffered 75% destruction, 3 of every 4 buildings damaged beyond repair. The medieval heart of the city, architecture dating to the 11th and 12th centuries, was gone. William the Conqueror's castle remained, its massive stone walls having survived worse than 20th century artillery, but the town that had grown around it for 900 years was obliterated. Argentan sustained 60% destruction. Trun, Chambois, and smaller villages suffered 50 to 80% losses. These were not military targets in any strategic sense, they were simply in the way when armies decided to fight there. The medieval street plans that had survived centuries disappeared in weeks, replaced eventually by wider roads and modern buildings that erased historical continuity. The civilian experience of being trapped between armies appears in fragments of testimony collected by French authorities after liberation. Henri Garnier, a farmer near Trun, described August 17th, "We heard the Germans coming through our fields all night. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, we couldn't tell, in the darkness. Some knocked on our door, asking for water. We gave it to them, what else could we do? At dawn, Allied aircraft came. We heard the rockets, the cannons, the explosions. Some Germans tried to hide in our barn. A shell hit it. The barn burned with them inside. We couldn't help. We just hid in our cellar and prayed. When it was over, there were bodies in our yard, burned vehicles in our fields, and our barn was ashes. The soldiers moved on. We remained with the dead." This pattern repeated across hundreds of farms, civilians trapped between forces they couldn't control, surviving by hiding and luck, emerging to find their property destroyed and their land contaminated with the debris of war. The agricultural devastation extended beyond immediate battle damage into long-term economic catastrophe. Norman agriculture depended on livestock, particularly cattle and horses, used for dairy production and fieldwork. The battles killed thousands of animals caught in artillery fire, air attacks, or simply abandoned without food and water as owners fled or died. Fields that should have been harvested in August were instead cratered by shells, contaminated with unexploded ordnance, or trampled into mud by thousands of vehicles. The autumn 1944 planting season was missed entirely. Farmers couldn't work, land that was still being cleared of bodies and explosives. The economic impact rippled through years. A 1946 French government report estimated agricultural productivity in the Falaise region at 30% of pre-war levels, recovering only slowly through the late 40s. Farms that had sustained families for generations were abandoned because reconstruction costs exceeded their value. The death toll among French civilians will never be precisely known because record-keeping collapsed during the battle. Official French estimates suggest 1,000 to 2,000 civilian deaths in the pocket area during August 1944, but these numbers are reconstructions based on population records before and after, cemetery records, and testimony from survivors. Many dead were never identified bodies buried in mass graves or simply never recovered from collapsed buildings. A priest in Chambois, Father Michel Arnaud, maintained a handwritten register of civilian deaths that survived the war. It lists 137 names of parishioners known to have died, with notes: killed by artillery fire, died when house collapsed, caught in crossfire, cause unknown. The register ends with a notation: these are only those whose deaths I can confirm. Many others are missing and presumed dead, but without witnesses or remains, we cannot be certain. The psychological trauma of civilians who survived matched or exceeded that of soldiers, but received virtually no formal treatment. There were no psychiatric services for French civilians in 1944, no recognition that witnessing such horror would produce lasting mental health effects. Women who had watched their children die in their arms, men who had been forced to bury neighbours in mass graves, children who had spent weeks in cellars listening to battles, above all, were expected simply to resume normal life once liberation arrived. Some did, through resilience or denial or sheer necessity. Others never recovered. A 1950s French psychiatric study of Norman populations included high rates of what would now be diagnosed as PTSD among civilians who had lived through the August 1944 battles, rates comparable to combat veterans. The trauma became part of family histories passed down through generations as stories that shaped how communities remembered the war. The response of Allied authorities to French civilian needs was generous in intent but inadequate in scale. Military government units distributed emergency food supplies, provided medical care through military hospitals, and organised labour details to clear roads and bury dead. But Allied forces were themselves moving east, pursuing the retreating Germans, and could not spare resources for extensive reconstruction. French civilian authorities had little capacity, the Vichy government had collapsed, the Free French government was only beginning to establish itself, local officials were often missing or discredited by collaboration. Into this vacuum came individual initiative and international charity, the American Red Cross, Canadian relief organisations, and eventually the Marshall Plan would provide reconstruction assistance. But in August and September 1944, civilians mostly fended for themselves amid ruins. The contrast between military triumph and civilian catastrophe created moral tensions that rarely appeared in official narratives but pervaded civilian memory. A Canadian victory parade through Falaise in early September, intended to celebrate liberation, marched past ruins and refugees. Soldiers, already uncomfortable with the destruction they had caused, even in pursuit of legitimate military objectives, found themselves cheered by civilians who had lost everything. The scene was simultaneously genuine. The French truly were grateful for liberation from German occupation, and surreal, celebrating amid devastation so complete that the town being liberated barely existed. A Canadian private's diary entry from September 5th captured the dissonance. They waved French flags and threw flowers at our trucks, but their town is rubble. We liberated them from the Germans, but we also destroyed their homes. How do you balance that? They don't seem to blame us, but I blame us. We should have found a better way. The long-term reconstruction of the Falaise region consumed decades and fundamentally altered the character of affected towns. When rebuilding began in earnest in the late 1940s, practical considerations trumped historical preservation. Medieval street plans that would have constrained modern vehicle traffic were abandoned in favour of wider, straighter roads. Historical architecture was replaced with functional modern buildings. The result was towns that were cleaner, more efficient, and completely disconnected from their pre-war character. Older residents who returned after evacuation described feeling like strangers in places where they had lived their entire lives. The buildings looked different, the streets were unfamiliar, the communities had been scattered and only partially returned. In a very real sense, the towns liberated in 1944 never came back. They were replaced by new towns built on the same sites, bearing the same names, but fundamentally different places. The question of whether the civilian cost was justified, whether the military value of the Falaise encirclement was worth the destruction of Norman communities, admits no comfortable answer. Allied commanders faced genuine military necessity. German forces had to be defeated, which required combat, which inevitably caused civilian casualties when fought in populated areas. Alternative strategies might have inflicted fewer civilian losses, but at cost of Allied military lives, or prolonged German occupation that would have caused different suffering. French civilians themselves generally acknowledged this reality in post-war testimony. They understood that liberation required battle, that their suffering was tragic but necessary, that blame belonged to Germany for starting the war rather than to Allies for finishing it. Yet understanding necessity doesn't eliminate grief or erase trauma. The French caught between armies at Falaise paid a price for liberation that included losing their homes, their communities, and in many cases their lives. Their experience deserves remembering alongside military narratives that emphasize tactical success while minimizing the human cost to non-combatants. Washington, D.C., 1946. The United States Army Historical Division published its official account of the Normandy campaign, emphasizing Allied success and minimizing controversy. The Falaise Pocket received extensive coverage as a major victory that destroyed German military power in France and enabled the rapid Allied advance to the German border. The boundary decision at Argentan was described as tactically sound, given the need to avoid friendly fire between converging forces. The delay in closing the gap was attributed to fierce German resistance rather than Allied coordination failures. This official history, written by military historians with access to operational records but also pressure to present American forces positively, established the initial narrative framework. It emphasized triumph, downplayed shortcomings, and created the version of events that would be taught in American military schools for years. But it was not the only version, and the debate had barely begun. Chester Wilmot's 1952 book, The Struggle for Europe, detonated a historiographical controversy that would last decades. Wilmot, an Australian war correspondent who had covered the campaign, argued that American commanders had been too cautious at Falaise, that Bradley's decision to stop at Argentan reflected political deference to Montgomery rather than military necessity, and that the incomplete encirclement had strategic consequences that prolonged the war. He contrasted American caution at Argentan with Patton's aggressive pursuit elsewhere, suggesting inconsistency in American command philosophy. And he explicitly criticized Bradley's leadership, arguing that a more decisive commander would have pushed to Falaise regardless of boundary agreements. The book became a bestseller in Britain and Europe, vindicating Montgomery in many British readers' eyes. In America, it provoked outrage. Veterans organizations denounced it, military historians wrote rebuttals, and Bradley himself was moved to defend his decisions in his own memoir. Bradley's 1951 memoir, A Soldier's Story, addressed Falaise extensively, defending the boundary decision as necessary to prevent confusion between American and Canadian forces converging on the same objective. He argued that German forces trapped in the pocket were already largely destroyed by artillery and air power, that the soldiers who escaped were mostly without equipment, and that pursuing them beyond Argentan would have risked Allied casualties for minimal additional gain. He noted that Montgomery's forces were supposed to close from the north, but were delayed by stronger than expected resistance, implying that if fault existed, it belonged to British and Canadian execution rather than American caution. The memoir was carefully written, acknowledging different perspectives while defending his choices, and it established the American counter-narrative to Wilmot's British favouring account. The battle over Falaise had moved from Norman fields to published histories, from military operations to national pride. Dwight Eisenhower's approach to the controversy exemplified his role as coalition manager even after the war. His 1948 memoir, Crusade in Europe, defended both Montgomery and Bradley, praised Canadian and Polish forces, emphasized the victory's magnitude, and avoided explicitly criticizing anyone's decisions. He acknowledged that, in retrospect, perhaps American forces might have advanced beyond Argentan, which was about as close as he came to second-guessing Bradley. But he immediately added that such decisions must be judged in the context of information available at the time, not with the perfect clarity of hindsight. This diplomatic language satisfied no one completely, but offended no one severely, which was precisely Eisenhower's intention. As a political figure by 1948, he would run for president in 1952. Eisenhower needed to maintain relationships with all parties and could not afford definitive statements that would alienate significant constituencies. German generals' memoirs, published primarily in the 1950s and 60s, offered their own perspective on Falaise that complicated Allied narratives. Hans Beidl's Invasion 1944 and Friedrich von der Heete's accounts emphasized Allied air superiority as the decisive factor more than ground force execution. They argued that the Falaise encirclement succeeded not because of brilliant Allied ground tactics, but because overwhelming air power made German movement impossible. This interpretation, while self-serving in minimizing German tactical failures, contained truth. German accounts also emphasized Hitler's catastrophic interference, particularly the Mortain offensive, that wasted time and resources when retreat was the only rational option. These memoirs portrayed German commanders as competent professionals, hamstrung by political leadership, a narrative that downplayed Wehrmacht complicity in Nazi crimes, but contributed to understanding operational details from the German perspective. The opening of archives in the 1970s and 80s enabled more rigorous historical analysis based on primary documents rather than published memoirs. Researchers gained access to operational orders, intelligence assessments, radio transcripts, and after-action reports from all sides. This documentary evidence revealed complexities that memoir authors had glossed over or misremembered. For example, detailed study of Canadian operations showed that Totalize had been more carefully planned than critics suggested, that German resistance had genuinely exceeded intelligence predictions, and that Montgomery's caution reflected realistic assessment of enemy capabilities rather than timidity. Similarly, examination of American records showed that Bradley had faced genuine concerns about friendly fire, given the poor radio coordination between American and Canadian forces. The archives didn't resolve controversies, but provided evidence that complicated simple narratives of success or failure, caution or aggression. The 1980s and 90s brought synthesis works by historians with access to all archives and distance from wartime passions. Max Hastings' Overlord in 1984, Carlo D'Este's Decision in Normandy in 1983, and later works by Anthony Beevor and Rick Atkinson presented balanced accounts that acknowledged Allied successes and failures, praised and criticized commanders from all nations, and placed Falaise in broader operational context. These historians generally concluded that Falaise was a significant but incomplete victory, that both Bradley and Montgomery bore some responsibility for the delayed closure, that Allied coordination problems cost opportunities, but that German recovery capabilities had been underestimated by everyone. The emerging consensus recognized complexity rather than assigning singular blame, acknowledging that coalition warfare created friction, that operational decisions involved trade-offs with no perfect solutions, and that the gap between optimal and actual execution was inevitable in combat. The persistent question of whether complete encirclement would have shortened the war remains debated, but with more sophisticated analysis. Modern historians examine not just the immediate military effects, but the cascading consequences through autumn and winter 1944. They trace unit lineages from Falaise to Arnhem to the Bulge, showing how escaped forces contributed to later battles. They analyze German replacement systems to assess how quickly destroyed divisions could have been rebuilt. They model logistical constraints to determine whether Allied forces could have exploited more complete victory even if achieved. The consensus that emerges is that complete encirclement at Falaise might have shortened the war by weeks or perhaps months, not years, and that this would have saved thousands of lives, a significant achievement but not a war-ending blow. The question shifts from could it have ended the war to how many additional lives would earlier closure have saved, which admits no certain answer but focuses on the human stakes rather than abstract strategic success. National perspectives continue shaping historical interpretation in subtle ways, even among professional historians. British historians tend to emphasize Montgomery's planning and the fierceness of German resistance, contextualizing the delay as inevitable given enemy capabilities. American historians tend to emphasize Patton's rapid exploitation and potential opportunities missed through excessive caution, suggesting faster closure was possible. Canadian historians emphasize their forces' sacrifices and the difficulty of the mission assigned them, arguing that criticism of their advance rate undervalues the combat they faced. Polish historians emphasize the stand at Maczuga as symbol of Polish determination to fight for European freedom despite their own nation's subjugation. German historians emphasize the organizational competence that enabled partial escape despite overwhelming Allied advantages. These different emphases reflect not necessarily bias, but the aspects of the battle that resonate most strongly within each national military tradition and historical consciousness. The ultimate lesson from decades of historical debate may be that complex military operations rarely have simple explanations or clear conclusions about right and wrong decisions. Falaise involved dozens of commanders making hundreds of decisions based on incomplete information under extreme pressure. Some decisions proved better than others in retrospect, but few were obviously wrong given what was known at the time. The boundary decision at Argentan reflected reasonable concerns about coordination, even if more aggressive action might have succeeded. The delay reaching Falaise reflected genuinely difficult combat, even if better tactics might have accelerated progress. The gap remaining open reflected friction inherent in coalition warfare, even if better communication might have closed it faster. Acknowledging this complexity doesn't absolve commanders of responsibility, but places their decisions in realistic context. The battle after the battle, the argument over what happened and why, serves purposes beyond determining historical accuracy. It reflects continuing negotiation over national contributions, military reputations, and lessons learned for future conflicts where similar challenges will inevitably arise. Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, present day. Officers from Allied nations sit in a classroom at the United States Army Command and General Staff College, studying a case labeled the Falaise Encirclement, August 1944. The scenario they're examining presents the situation on August 12th. American forces at Argentan, Canadian forces 10 miles from Falaise, Germans streaming through a 15-mile gap. The question posed to these modern officers, what is the correct decision? Push American forces beyond the boundary to close the gap faster, maintain the boundary, and coordinate carefully with allies. Some variant between these extremes? The officers debate applying modern doctrine to historical situations, discovering that clear answers remain elusive even 80 years later with perfect hindsight. The Falaise Pocket endures as a teaching case precisely because it illustrates timeless challenges in military operations. Coordination between allies, balancing speed against security, deciding when to deviate from plans versus when to adhere to them. The specific tactical lessons military institutions draw from Falaise have evolved as warfare changed but remain relevant. The United States Army's Field Manual on Offensive Operations discusses encirclement tactics with explicit reference to Falaise as an example of incomplete encirclement with significant enemy forces escaping due to gaps in the lesson emphasized. Physical closure of encirclement must occur rapidly before enemy forces can organize breakout attempts, and that requires forward elements to accept risk by pushing ahead of supporting forces. British Army doctrine on coalition operations references Falaise when discussing the importance of clear boundary delineation between Allied forces, but also the need for flexibility when tactical situations change faster than boundaries can be renegotiated. The lesson: pre-agreed boundaries prevent confusion but shouldn't become so rigid that they prevent exploitation of opportunities. The role of air power in encirclement operations, demonstrated so devastatingly at Falaise, fundamentally shaped post-war military doctrine. Soviet military theory in the Cold War era incorporated lessons from observing Falaise, emphasizing that encircled forces in the age of air supremacy faced exponentially higher casualties than in previous eras. Soviet doctrine for breakthrough operations specifically addressed the need to either achieve air superiority or conduct operations at night to avoid the fate of German forces at Falaise. American airland battle doctrine developed in the 1980s explicitly referenced Falaise as validating the integration of tactical air power with ground maneuver. The concept that air forces could serve as a mobile reserve to exploit ground force successes, attacking enemy forces, attempting to escape encirclement, derived directly from analyzing the effectiveness of Allied air attacks in the Falaise Pocket. The Israeli Defense Forces studied Falaise intensively after the 1973 Yom Kippur War, particularly the encirclement of Egyptian Third Army in Sinai. Israeli armor had crossed the Suez Canal and threatened to surround Egyptian forces, creating a situation analogous to Falaise, with Israeli forces closing from multiple directions against trapped enemies. The Israelis drew lessons about the importance of rapidly completing encirclement before international political pressure forced ceasefires, about the value of air supremacy in preventing enemy escape, and about the need to balance complete destruction of enemy forces against broader strategic and political objectives. Israeli officers studied the boundary decision at Argentan as a negative example demonstrating the cost of coordination problems in coalition warfare, which validated Israel's preference for unified national command structures. Ukrainian military study of Falaise took on urgent relevance after 2022, when Ukrainian forces faced potential encirclement around cities like Mariupol and later attempted encirclements of Russian forces in areas like the Izium salient. Ukrainian officers examined historical cases of fighting from encirclement, breakout attempts, and escape tactics. The question, how do you escape encirclement when you don't control the air, became immediately practical rather than theoretical. Ukrainian analysis of Falaise focused on German escape tactics, night movement, dispersion, abandoning equipment to move faster, using rearguards to buy time, and on the percentage of forces that successfully escaped despite air supremacy. The historical lesson that, even under worse conditions, determined forces can exfiltrate 30 to 40% of trapped personnel proved both encouraging and cautionary depending on which side of the encirclement you occupied. Russian military theorists have studied Falaise as an example of destruction of enemy forces in pocket operations, placing it alongside their own historical operations like the encirclement of German forces at Stalingrad. Russian doctrine on offensive operations emphasizes the importance of double envelopment, attacking from multiple directions simultaneously, which Falaise demonstrated successfully despite incomplete execution. Russian analysis tends to emphasize objective factors like force ratios, terrain, and logistics, rather than command decisions, viewing the partial German escape from Falaise as statistically predictable given the size of the pocket and the number of escape routes, rather than as a failure of Allied decision-making. This perspective suggests that perfect encirclement of large forces is rare, and that leaky encirclements are the norm rather than the exception. NATO exercises in the Cold War and post-Cold War eras frequently incorporated Falaise-inspired scenarios to practice coalition coordination in fluid operational situations. Exercise planners would create situations where forces from multiple nations needed to coordinate encirclement of enemy forces without clear command relationships or well-established communications. These exercises consistently revealed the same problems that affected actual operations at Falaise. Language barriers, slowed coordination, different national doctrines created expectation mismatches, and boundary decisions became contentious as tactical situations evolved. A 1998 NATO exercise after-action report explicitly noted, coordination problems experienced in this exercise mirror those documented at Falaise in 1944, suggesting these are persistent challenges in coalition operations rather than unique historical circumstances. The lesson, technological improvements in communication don't eliminate friction when organizations with different cultures and doctrines must cooperate under stress. The organizational lesson about decentralized command, comparing German Auftragstaktik mission orders versus Allied, more centralized control, appeared in multiple analyses of Falaise. German forces escaped in part because junior commanders could make decisions about escape routes and timing without waiting for higher approval, while Allied forces sometimes waited for guidance when local initiative might have closed gaps faster. This observation influenced American military reforms in the 1980s that emphasized decentralized execution within centralized intent, explicitly trying to capture the advantages of German command philosophy while maintaining overall coordination. The concept of commander's intent in modern American doctrine, that subordinates should understand the purpose of missions so they can adapt methods without waiting for approval traces. Intellectual lineage, partly to analysis of why Germans escaped Falaise despite overwhelming Allied advantages. Modern precision weaponry has changed the tactical details but not the fundamental dynamics of encirclement operations. Today's GPS-guided munitions can strike with far greater accuracy than 1944 artillery or bombs, increasing the lethality of fire on trapped forces. Modern surveillance satellites, drones, sensors makes concealment far harder than in an era when cloud cover could hide movement. Yet the basic challenge remains physically closing the pocket with ground forces before enemy forces escape. A 2020 RAND Corporation study comparing historical encirclements from Cannes through Falaise to modern operations concluded that technological advantages accelerate but don't eliminate the time required for ground forces to physically link up and seal escape routes. The study noted, Falaise demonstrates that even with total air supremacy, significant percentages of trapped forces can escape if ground force closure is delayed. Modern surveillance improves targeting but doesn't replace the need for rapid ground maneuver. The lesson: technology enhances but doesn't eliminate the importance of aggressive ground operations. The counterinsurgency operations in Iraq and Afghanistan saw American forces applying lessons from studying encirclement operations like Falaise to very different tactical situations. Operations to seal off insurgent-held urban areas, creating cordons to prevent enemy escape while clearing houses, reflected in miniature the same challenges of closing escape routes before enemies could flee. American officers planning operations in Fallujah or Normandy explicitly referenced historical encirclement operations when designing their concepts, though obviously at drastically smaller scale and against different enemies. The lesson that proved relevant: incomplete cordons that allow enemy escape make subsequent operations more difficult because you must fight the same enemies again, while complete cordons that trap all enemy forces enable more decisive outcomes. This was Falaise's lesson translated to urban counterinsurgency contexts. The ultimate question of Falaise's relevance to modern warfare divides analysts. Skeptics argue that fundamental changes in warfare, precision weapons, information networks, integrated combined arms, much higher pace of operations make World War II battles irrelevant beyond general educational value. Adherents argue that human and organizational factors that shaped Falaise remain constant. Coalition warfare creates friction. Boundary decisions remain contentious. Aggressive commanders clash with cautious commanders. Incomplete information forces commanders to make risky decisions. And encirclements remain incomplete more often than not. The moderate position, probably closest to consensus, acknowledges that specific tactics from Falaise are obsolete, but that the operational and organizational challenges it illustrated remain relevant. Officers study Falaise not to learn how to coordinate artillery barrages or fighter-bomber strikes. Those specific tactics have changed completely, but to understand how coalition command structures function under stress, how pursuit operations succeed or fail, and how human factors like personality conflicts between commanders affect military outcomes. These elements endure across eras, making Falaise not just history but continuous education. August 19th, 2024, Hill 262, Maczuga. An elderly man stands at the Polish memorial, leaning heavily on his cane, staring down at the valley where 80 years ago he fought as a teenage soldier. Jan Kowalski is 97 years old, one of perhaps a dozen surviving Polish veterans of the Falaise battle. He has returned for the 80th anniversary ceremonies, knowing this will certainly be his last visit to the place that defined his life. A young Polish officer stands beside him, detailed to provide assistance, and asks what he remembers most. Kowalski is silent for a long moment, eyes distant. The sound, he finally says: artillery from all directions, aircraft engines overhead constantly, men screaming. It never stopped. 3 days and nights of noise that felt like it would never end. He gestures toward the valley. Down there, thousands died. Germans trying to escape, us trying to stop them. I killed men down there. They were trying to kill me. We were all so young, and now we're all so old, the few of us who survived. He falls silent again, lost in memories, too painful and too important to abandon. The Montgomery Memorial Museum sits at the edge of the battlefield, opened in 1994 for the 50th anniversary. Inside, artifacts tell the story through objects. Helmets with bullet holes, rifles still showing mud from Norman fields, uniforms worn by soldiers now dead for decades, personal effects, letters, photos, watches carried by men who didn't survive to reclaim them. Each item represents a life, a story, a future that ended in August 1944. A German officer's diary, displayed in a case, contains the last entry, dated August 18th. We are surrounded. No food for 2 days. Ammunition nearly exhausted. If I do not survive, please tell my family I did my duty. The next page is blank. Visitors move through the museum quietly, confronting the intimacy of these remnants, the way objects connect present to past more viscerally than words. Outside, preserved sections of the battlefield show terrain largely unchanged, the same rolling hills, the same road corridors, though the wreckage is long gone, and fields now grow wheat where men and horses once lay dead. The annual August 19th ceremony brings together descendants of those who fought, local French residents, military representatives from multiple nations, and visitors who come to pay respects to history. The ceremony follows familiar patterns: laying wreaths at monuments, speeches by officials, military honor guards firing salutes, playing of national anthems, but beneath the formal protocol runs genuine emotion. Children stand beside graves of grandfathers they never met. French residents honor those who died, liberating their region even at cost of destroying their towns. Polish, Canadian, American, British, German representatives share space at monuments, former enemies now joined by common acknowledgement of war's costs. The landscape itself becomes memorial. This ground is sacred not through designation but through what happened here, through the blood that soaked into soil now covered by peaceful farmland. Walking the battlefield today requires imagination to envision what occurred here. The road from Falaise through Trun to Chambois is paved and quiet, marked by memorial plaques at intervals, noting significant events. Here, Canadian and Polish forces linked up August 19, 1944. In this area, German 7th Army attempted to break encirclement. The corridor of death is now a corridor of 19. Memory, travelled by occasional tourists following marked routes, by school groups on educational trips, by veterans in declining numbers making final pilgrimages. The Dives River still flows through valley bottoms, still marshy and difficult terrain for military vehicles, though now crossed by modern bridges. Farm fields stretch in all directions, planted and harvested in cycles that have repeated 80 times since the battle. Nature has reclaimed the battlefield, as nature always does, but memory persists in the monuments and markers that dot the landscape. The preservation of the Falaise battlefield exists in tension between development pressure and historical significance. Much of the area is private farmland, worked by farmers whose primary interest is agriculture rather than historical tourism. They occasionally find artifacts while ploughing shell fragments, cartridge cases, pieces of equipment, and occasionally still find unexploded ordnance requiring disposal by military bomb teams. The French government has designated some areas as protected historical sites where development is restricted, but this represents only a fraction of the actual battlefield area. Economic reality means that much of where the battle occurred is now housing developments, shopping centres, industrial parks. The battlefield exists in fragments, preserved sections separated by modern development, requiring visitors to mentally reconstruct the continuous battle space from isolated preserved points. This pattern reflects how most societies handle battlefield preservation, protecting symbolically important sites while allowing normal development elsewhere. The German military cemetery at Huisnes-sur-Mer, near Mont-Saint-Michel, contains nearly 12,000 burials, many from the Falaise battles. The cemetery occupies a circular plot with graves arranged in concentric circles, most marked simply Ein Deutscher Soldat, because identification was impossible. Visitors here confront uncomfortable questions about how to remember soldiers who fought for an evil cause. Were they victims or perpetrators? Soldiers doing duty or willing participants in aggressive war? The cemetery's designers made choices reflecting these tensions, somber but not glorifying, acknowledging death without celebrating service, creating space for grief without endorsing the cause for which these men died. German visitors, particularly elderly Germans whose relatives died here, mourn personally, even while acknowledging historically. The cemetery enables this complicated remembrance, this grief that contains guilt, this mourning that excludes pride. It represents perhaps the most difficult form of battlefield commemoration, honoring individual humanity while rejecting collective purpose. The battlefield's meaning has evolved across generations, shaped by changing historical circumstances. For the generation that fought, it was lived experience, trauma, loss, victory, survival, specific memories of specific moments. For their children, the baby boom generation, it was family history stories told at dinner tables, absences explained, pride in parental sacrifice mixed with relief they weren't tested similarly. For their grandchildren and great-grandchildren, it is increasingly abstract history, important but distant, commemorated through civic duty rather than personal connection. As the last veterans die, the battle transitions from living memory to historical event, from testimony to documentation, from experience to interpretation. This transition is inevitable and changes how the battlefield is understood. Without survivors to provide witness, later generations rely on documents, artifacts, monuments-mediated memories rather than direct transmission. Something essential is lost in this transition, but something is also gained. Distance enables analytical perspective that proximity often prevents. The question of what lessons contemporary visitors should draw from the Falaise battlefield resists easy answers. Should we focus on Allied victory and the liberation of France from Nazi occupation? Should we emphasize the human cost and the tragedy of war, regardless of which side soldiers fought on? Should we extract tactical lessons for modern military professionals? Should we use it as cautionary tale about nationalism and aggressive war? Different visitors arrive with different purposes and leave with different lessons. A French schoolchild learns about liberation and resistance. A military officer studies command decisions and operational execution. A pacifist sees confirmation that war is horror, regardless of justification. A descendant connects personally to family history. The battlefield accommodates these multiple perspectives, means different things to different visitors, serves simultaneously as victory monument, war memorial, historical site, and cemetery. Perhaps this multiplicity is appropriate, that such momentous events should not reduce to single interpretations but remain complex and contested. The physical traces that persist 80 years after the battle are increasingly subtle but discoverable for those who know how to look. Careful observers can still find slight depressions in fields where shell craters were filled, but compressed earth settled differently than surrounding soil. Tree lines sometimes show gaps where older trees were destroyed and replacements never quite matched the original spacing. Road alignments occasionally deviate around areas where the wreckage was so dense that builders simply bypassed it rather than clear it completely. And occasionally, after heavy rains, artifacts surface that were buried in August 1944 and have worked their way to the surface through frost heave and erosion. The land remembers in its way, even when human memory fades. The battlefield is simultaneously specific historical site and universal symbol of war's destructiveness, particular French countryside, and representative killing ground, memorial to specific individuals and reminder of war's general horror. The final image appropriate to close this narrative is the view from Maczuga at sunset, when tour buses have departed and monuments stand quiet, when the valley lies peaceful in fading light, and it requires effort to imagine the chaos that filled this space 8 decades ago. The same fields, the same hills, the same sky, but entirely different meaning, depending on whether you saw them on August 19th, 1944 or August 19th, 2024. This is the strange nature of battlefields. They are ordinary places where extraordinary things occurred, everyday landscapes suddenly made sacred through what humans did there. Standing on that hill, looking down at the corridor where thousands died, the questions raised throughout this narrative remain unresolved and perhaps unresolvable. Could it have been done better? Should different decisions have been made? What did these deaths accomplish and what did they cost? The answers matter less than the questions themselves, the commitment to asking them, the refusal to accept easy narratives about glorious victory or noble sacrifice without acknowledging the complexity, the suffering, the humanity of all who were caught in those terrible days. The gap closed, but never completely, and in that gap, physical and metaphorical, we find all the tragedy, triumph, and unanswered questions of war itself. The wheat grows now where men fell. The corridor of death has become a valley of memory. And we remember, because forgetting would dishonor both the dead and the duty their sacrifice imposes on the living to understand what war truly costs.